are facing deadlines, burning out, or feeling the heavy weight of daily life, your brain goes into overdrive. Stories offer an immediate escape hatch. Stepping into a well-crafted narrative allows you to hit the pause button on your own reality, giving your mind a chance to rest, reset, and regulate. When time stresses, stories heal. Welcome back to our late night family. I'm Alex, and this is True Horror Stories Film. If your chest feels tight with stress and sorrow tonight, imagine gentle hands on your shoulders, quietly lifting that burden away. I am a night owl just like you, and I know how exhausting it is to fight a restless mind in the dead of night. Tonight is a pure, unbroken escape for your peace. If this release is what you desperately need, please like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you are looking for safety from tonight. You can finally let go now.
Story 1. The green truck waited. I have repaired walk-in freezers in places most people never think about twice. Grocery stores in towns where the stoplight is still the kind that blinks yellow after 9 p.m. Restaurant kitchens where the grease has soaked so deep into the walls that the smell is structural. Cold storage units behind supermarkets in counties where the next supermarket is 40 miles of state road away and the locals know it. The work is not glamorous, and I do not pretend otherwise. My name is Daniel Croft. I am 38 years old, and I have been doing this for 11 years. I know how to read a compressor by the sound it makes under load. I know the specific weight of a wrench in a freezing room at 2 in the morning. I know how to be alone in a building that has been empty for hours and feel nothing about it. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that I am not someone who frightens easily. I need you to hold that in mind for what comes after. This happened the previous autumn in a small town in northern Pennsylvania I will not name, not because I cannot, but because I have no interest in sending anyone there. My company dispatched me on a Thursday morning with a 3-night work order, walk-in freezers at a family-owned supermarket, aging units that had been repaired by 3 different contractors and were still not right. Standard work. I had done it 100 times. I loaded my tools into the truck, drove north on roads that got narrower and more poorly lit as the hours passed, and watched the landscape shift from suburban sprawl to something older and less maintained. By the time I reached the town in the early evening, the light had gone amber and low. There were more empty storefronts than open ones. A barber shop with a closed sign that looked permanent. A laundromat with half its letters missing from the sign. A hardware store that might have been open or might not have been. I slowed down and could not tell. The main street was 4 blocks long and the last 2 blocks were dark. A Dollar General at one end, a gas station at the other. In between, the particular silence of a place that used to be more than it currently is. The motel my company had booked was on the edge of town, right where the state road turned back into nothing. It was a single-story building, the kind where every room door faces the parking lot. 12 rooms in a row under an overhang that was shedding rust along its gutters. The sign was lit at least. 4 or 5 cars in the lot. The office window was yellow and warm from the inside in the way that only old fluorescent lighting achieves. Slightly wrong, slightly green underneath the warmth. I parked and sat in the truck for a moment, eating the last of a gas station sandwich I had started 2 hours back and looking at the building. There was nothing wrong with it. Cheap motels look exactly like this in every small American town, and I had stayed in 30 of them over the years. Worn and functional, and not interested in you. I was tired. My shoulder ached from a long drive. I had exactly 0 thoughts about what the next 3 nights might hold. The woman at the desk was somewhere in her 60s, white-haired, with the careful friendliness of someone who has worked in hospitality long enough to perform warmth automatically without requiring it of herself. She wore a cardigan in the color of old cream, and she smelled faintly of floral soap. She asked for my credit card and my license, and she typed my information into a computer that sounded like it belonged to a different decade. Then she gave me my key, and then she said something I did not know what to do with. She said if anyone knocked on my door after dark, I should not open it unless it was her or the owner. She said if I heard anything unusual outside, I should call the front office and not get involved. She said it the way you might tell a first-time camper not to leave food out at night. Matter of fact, informational, as if the advice were simply part of the standard check-in and had nothing alarming underneath it. I asked if the area was dangerous. She said there were sometimes drifters, that they liked to approach guests for money. I stood there at the desk for a moment, looking at the side of her face, because she had already looked away from me and was glancing toward the parking lot window behind my shoulder. I remember thinking, that is an odd piece of advice to give to a person who just walked in and is clearly exhausted. I remember thinking, she did not look at me when she said it, but I was tired, the way you are after a long drive through November mountain roads, and I told myself I was reading into nothing. My room was near the far end of the building, second to last. It was clean the way motels are clean when they are old enough that clean is all they can offer. Surfaces wiped down, sheets that smelled of industrial detergent, a dresser with cigarette burns in the laminate. The carpet was dark near the bathroom threshold in a way that could have been a spill or could have been something else, and I made the automatic decision not to look too closely, which is a skill you develop after enough motel stays. I dropped my bag. I turned on the lamp. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my phone for a few minutes without reading anything on it. I walked down to the gas station for dinner, a microwave sandwich, a bottle of water, a bag of pretzels that I ate half of on the walk back. The air outside was cold in the specific way of Pennsylvania mountains in October. Not just cool, but thin, carrying the smell of dead leaves and something underneath the leaves, earth and wet rock and the faraway suggestion of wood smoke. My breath fogged in the lot lights. That was when I noticed the truck. It was parked 2 spaces from mine. An older model pickup, dark green, the kind of vehicle that reads as completely ordinary in this part of the state. The engine was running. I could see the faint shimmer of exhaust in the cold air, but the headlights were off. I registered this without slowing my pace. I walked past it at the angle that put me in the best position to see the driver's side window, the way you learn to do in parking lots at night, without knowing you have learned it. The man behind the wheel did not turn his head when I passed. He did not adjust in his seat or check his mirror or do any of the things people do when someone walks past them in a quiet place. He sat with both hands on the wheel and he looked straight forward. I went inside and locked the door. I ate my sandwich watching a cooking show on the television mounted above the dresser. The sound low enough that it felt like company without demanding attention. I checked my work order for the following morning. I texted my wife that I had arrived. The room was warm enough, not comfortable exactly, but warm, and the lamp threw a yellow circle that made the space feel smaller and more manageable than it was. Around 10:30, I showered and got into bed. I was nearly asleep when I heard the footsteps. They came from the walkway outside, moving at a pace that was slightly too slow, slightly too deliberate. A pace that does not belong to someone walking purposefully toward a room. I did not move. I lay still and listened. They stopped directly outside my door. Not at the room next to mine, not passing by, but stopped. Right there. I counted. 1 second, 2, 5, 10, maybe 15 before they moved again, continuing down the walkway in the direction they had been heading. I told myself it was a guest who had lost count of the doors, or a person who stopped to check a phone. I told myself that because there was no alternative that made sense, and I was tired, and I wanted to sleep. A minute later, the footsteps came back from the other direction and stopped at my door again. I got up quietly and went to the peephole. The walkway was empty. I stood at the peephole for longer than I needed to, my hand flat against the door, and I noticed the lamp was still on behind me, which meant anyone on the other side of that door could see the shadow of my feet at the gap beneath it. I do not know how long I stayed at the peephole. My phone was on the nightstand and I did not go get it. That strikes me now as the strangest detail, that my first instinct was not to call anyone, not to document anything, but simply to stand there and watch the empty walkway through that circle of warped fisheye glass, as if looking hard enough would produce an explanation I could use. The walkway stayed empty. The lot lights threw their flat yellow across the concrete and the parked cars, and nothing moved in any of it. After a while, I stepped back and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands in my lap. I had a job in the morning, a compressor diagnostic that needed a full thermal read before 8 a.m. or the work order fell behind schedule. I remember thinking about that, about the specific sequence of steps I would need to run before the store opened, the order in which I would check the condenser coils, the sound the bad unit had been making according to the previous repair ticket. I held those thoughts deliberately, like a man arranging sandbags. The mind finds what it needs. I turned off the lamp and got back into bed. At 11:15, someone knocked on the door. 2 knocks, unhurried, evenly spaced. I did not move. I lay on my back in the dark and I breathed through my mouth slowly and I waited. The knock came again. The same 2 beats, the same interval, the same weight behind them. Not louder, not more urgent. Exactly the same as if produced by a machine. I got up and went to the peephole. Nobody there. That was the moment my body registered what my mind was still declining to process. Not fear, not quite, but something that precedes fear. A species of cold alertness that moves up from the stomach. My mouth had gone dry without thirst. I was aware of my own heartbeat in a way I had not been 60 seconds earlier. I stood at the peephole for another 30 seconds, watching nothing move in the walkway. Then I looked at the window. The curtain had shifted. It was not open. I could see the full width of it still covering the glass, but it had moved from where I had positioned it when I came in. The left edge had swung maybe 2 inches inward. The gap it left was narrow, a finger's width at most, but it was there, and it had not been there before. I crossed the room and pulled it firmly shut and stood with my back to the wall beside the window, the way I had seen people do in movies and always assumed was theatrical. It did not feel theatrical now. It felt like the only logical geometry available to me. From where I stood, I could hear the parking lot, or rather, I could hear the absence of sound in it. The specific quality of silence that a space has when it is being held still by someone in it. No wind, no passing cars on the state road, no night insects at this temperature. Just the soft electrical hum of the motel's exterior lighting, and underneath that, nothing at all. I went and got my phone. I did not call the front office yet. I am still not sure why. Something about the desk woman's voice when she had given me that advice. The way it had been too practiced, too level, the way she had already looked away before she finished the sentence, made me want to know more before I spoke to her again. I sat on the bed with the phone in my hand and thought about the truck in the lot, the engine running, the headlights off, both hands on the wheel. Around midnight, I heard the sound. It was brief, 2 seconds, maybe 3, and it came from directly outside the door. A metallic sliding, not quite a scrape, more like the sound of a key being tested in a lock that it does not quite fit. The kind of sound you make when you are trying to be quiet and mostly succeeding. I heard it once, and then once more, slightly different, as if the angle had adjusted. I moved to the door on the balls of my feet. The carpet was thin enough that I could feel the cold concrete floor underneath it. My hand went to the deadbolt automatically, confirming it was thrown before I even reached the peephole. I looked through. The walkway was not empty this time. There was a figure crouched low, so low that the peephole's angle barely caught them, just the crown of a dark baseball cap and one shoulder. the posture of someone making themselves small deliberately. I could not see a face. I could not see what they were doing with their hands. The crouch was professional, unhurried. The crouch of a person who had done this before and had calibrated exactly how low they needed to be to stay out of a standard peephole sightline. I stood there, eye at the glass, and I did not breathe. Then the figure straightened, rose to standing in one smooth motion, and I heard footsteps moving fast, not running, but covering ground quickly toward the end of the building in the direction of the truck. I called the front office. The woman answered on the second ring, and she sounded for a half second, genuinely annoyed, the automatic irritation of someone woken up. Then I told her someone had been crouched directly outside my door, and her voice changed, not into alarm, but into something flatter and more careful. She asked if I had opened the door. I said no. She told me to stay inside and that the owner would check the lot. 2 minutes later, headlights moved across the curtain in a slow arc, someone driving the full length of the parking lot. The office called back and said nobody was out there now. Probably just someone messing around. I asked if I should call the police, and the woman paused for a moment before she said it probably would not do much good unless the person came back. I thanked her and ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. I want to be precise about what I felt at that point, because I think it matters. I was not in a state of panic. My hands were steady enough. What I felt was a particular quality of attention, a sharpening of every input, sound and temperature, and the weight of the air in the room that I had not felt since a workplace accident 11 years ago when a compressor unit came off a ceiling mount and I had 4 seconds to move sideways out of its path. The body knows before the mind does. The body was already operating on a set of conclusions I had not yet reached consciously. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark with the lamp off and the phone face up on the pillow beside me, and I listened to the motel, the hum of the exterior lights, the occasional creak of the building contracting in the cold, a car on the state road, far away, and then nothing again. At 5:15 in the morning, my truck alarm went off, not the full horn. The door open chime that sounds when the cab light triggers. I was out of bed before I had finished processing the sound. I went to the window and moved the curtain a half-inch without touching the glass. There was a man standing at the driver's side of my truck with the door pulled half open. Tall, dark jacket, a hat pulled low so the lot light did not reach his face. He was turned away from me, looking at something inside the cab, and for a moment he was perfectly still. Then he turned and looked directly at my room window, not at the motel in general, not at the walkway, at my window, the specific rectangle of it, at the height where my face was. He held that look for 2 seconds. Then he shut the truck door quietly and walked away fast, toward the road that ran behind the property, and was gone before I had finished dialing 911. The dispatcher's voice was level and experienced. She asked me to stay inside and said officers were on their way. I stood at the window with the phone to my ear and watched the empty lot and thought, with the bizarre irrelevance of a mind grasping for ordinary ground, that I had left a water bottle in the cup holder and a phone charger coiled on the passenger seat. Nothing important, nothing worth taking, which meant, even then in the cold gray before dawn, I understood that the truck had not been the point. The police came in the half-light, and the lot filled briefly with the red and blue that made the whole scene feel like something from someone else's life. And while they walked the perimeter and checked my doors and wrote things into their notebooks, I sat on the edge of the bed in my room and realized I had been holding my jaw clenched for the better part of 6 hours, and I could not remember when I had started. The older officer came back alone. He asked me to step outside, away from the office window, away from the owner, who was standing near the ice machine with his canvas coat and his folded arms and his expression of careful neutrality. The older officer had a notepad, but he did not open it. He looked at me in the way of someone who has decided to give a person information they are not required to give. And he did it in the manner of a man who has made this particular decision before and knows the cost of it. He told me they had seen the green pickup before. He said there had been 2 other incidents at this motel in the previous 6 months. Men staying alone, traveling for work, unfamiliar with the area. In the first case, someone had attempted entry on the man's vehicle during the night. The man had heard movement outside his room, but had left before filing a complete report. In the second case, a guest had woken to find his motel room door standing open, the deadbolt thrown back, though he swore at length and with evident distress that he had locked it himself before sleeping. Nothing taken in either case. I asked the officer what he thought the end goal was. He looked at me for a moment without answering, and then he said he thought the group was following men who were traveling alone, identifying them at work sites or at gas stations or at the one bar in town that still had its lights on after 9, and then waiting until those men were isolated and stationary and beginning to trust the silence around them. He did not finish the sentence past that point. He did not need to. I packed my bag while 2 officers stood outside my door in the cold. I moved with the automatic efficiency of someone who has decided that speed is a form of safety now. Rolling clothes without folding them. Cords bundled without care. The tool bags already in the truck, because I had not unpacked them after the previous night. The room took me 4 minutes. I have packed faster, but not by much. Before I lifted the last bag, I dropped my phone charger. It landed half under the bed, and I crouched down to get it, and that was when I saw it. A square of newsprint folded twice, pushed almost flush against the baseboard beneath the headboard, far enough back that it would not have caught any light. I would not have seen it at all if the charger had not landed at the exact angle it did. I did not touch it with my hands. I used a pen to drag it out and unfold it. It was a piece of a local newspaper, torn into a rough square, the kind of tearing that is done quickly and by feel in low light. On one side was a fragment of a grocery store advertisement. On the other side, in blue ballpoint pen, written in block capitals that pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper, my room number, my truck's license plate, nothing else. No date, no name, no other mark. Just those 2 things, written by someone who had been watching long enough, and carefully enough, and close enough to record them. I stood up and showed it to the older officer without speaking. He looked at it for a long time. Then he took an evidence bag from his jacket pocket and held it open, and I dropped the paper in. He said he would be in touch. I left the motel before 1 in the morning, and I drove. Not toward another hotel. I was past hotels, past the idea of rooms with thin doors and parking lots visible from curtained windows. I drove south on state roads that were empty at that hour, the headlights cutting a moving circle of visibility out of the dark, and outside that circle the mountains and the trees and whatever was in them were simply absent. Simply not a thing I needed to account for. I drove for 2 hours. I made it most of the way home before I pulled into a rest area and sat in the truck with the engine running and the doors locked, and I let myself be still for the first time in 2 days. I did not sleep. I sat and looked at the orange sodium lights of the rest area, and I let my mind go over it in sequence. The advice at check-in, the footsteps, the peephole, the curtain, the note under the bed, and I tried to find the place where I had made a mistake. The decision point where a different choice would have changed the geometry of what happened. I do not think there was one. I think the decision had been made about me before I ever pulled into that parking lot, possibly as early as the gas station, 2 towns back where I had stopped for the microwave sandwich and paid at the counter where anyone could see me and hear me ask the clerk if he knew of any motels nearby. A man alone, tools in the truck bed, out-of-state plates. The note under the bed meant they had been in my room. Not during those 2 nights. The paper was already there when I arrived, pushed back against the baseboard, where the cleaning staff would not reach with a standard pass. It had been placed there before I checked in, possibly during the day, while the room sat empty between guests, possibly days before that, which meant the system was not reactive, not a matter of spotting a likely target and following them. The system had a base, a place to stage from, a position already established inside the perimeter before the target ever arrived. I thought about the owner, who had said people come and go. I thought about the woman at the desk who had told me it usually does not happen 2 nights in a row, and then immediately wished she had not. I thought about the room next door, empty at check-in, its lock worked open from outside by something that was not a key. I am a man who diagnoses systems for a living. I understand that when a component fails repeatedly in the same way, the fault is rarely in the component. The fault is in the design. Something in the architecture of that place was allowing this to happen, was possibly facilitating it. I did not know how far that facilitation extended, and I did not intend to stay long enough to find out. My company sent someone else to finish the job the following week. He stayed in a town 40 minutes further north. I found this out from the dispatch coordinator when I called to explain why I had left, and she told me in the voice of someone carefully not asking follow-up questions that he had completed the work without incident. I filed a full account with the police department before the end of that week, a written statement detailed in the order things occurred. The older officer called me after to confirm receipt and to tell me the investigation was ongoing. He did not tell me what ongoing meant in practical terms. I did not ask. For a while after, the physical symptoms were manageable. Ordinary disruptions of sleep, ordinary heightening of attention in parking lots and motel corridors, and anywhere a door faced outward onto a space I could not fully see. I am a practical man, and I handled it the practical way. I acknowledged the symptoms. I adjusted my habits where adjustment was possible. I continued doing my work. What I could not adjust was the note. Not the fact of it. I had made a kind of peace with the fact of it, with what it implied about the system and the timeline and the people running it. What I could not adjust was the specific image of someone crouched in that room in whatever light was available, pressing a ballpoint pen hard enough to groove the paper, writing down 2 pieces of information with the calm precision of a person completing a routine task. My room number, my plate. The handwriting had been neat. That was the detail I could not put down, not the threat implicit in it, but the neatness, the absence of urgency in it, the quality of someone doing something they had done before and expected to do again. It meant I had not been the first entry in whatever record they were keeping. It meant there were other pieces of paper. The motel is still open. I looked it up some weeks after, not because I intended to do anything with the information, but because I needed to know. The same sign in the photograph on the booking site, the same single-story building with the doors facing the lot. 4.2 stars, 14 reviews, most of them brief and without detail. One review, from a man whose username suggested he was also traveling for work, said only, "Fine for one night, nothing special. Would not go out of your way." He had checked in on a Tuesday in August. He had checked out the following morning. I have thought about that review more than I should. I have thought about whether he heard footsteps, whether he lay in the dark and told himself it was the house settling, the building contracting in the cold, another guest confused about which room was theirs, whether there was a piece of paper under his bed that he never found because he did not drop anything, because nothing sent him to his knees on that particular floor. I hope there was not. I think there probably was. What I have not been able to account for, and what I suspect I will carry with me for a long time yet, is this. The paper was there before I arrived. which means someone had decided something about me before I had decided anything about that town. And that asymmetry, the gap between what I knew and what was already known about me, is the thing that still wakes me at 3 in the morning in my own house, in my own bed, with the doors locked and the alarm set, reaching for my phone before I am fully conscious of why. I want to be precise about what changed and what did not. What did not change? I went back to work the Monday after I came home. I drove to a grocery distribution center in central Ohio and spent 3 days replacing evaporator coils in a freezer unit the size of a small house. The work was good. The foreman was a quiet man named Gerald who communicated almost entirely in nods and who made a pot of coffee at 6 a.m. every morning that was strong enough to dissolve the specific fatigue of a man who has not been sleeping well. I was grateful for both the work and the coffee and for Gerald's complete indifference to conversation. I needed a week of problems I knew how to solve. What changed? Everything that happens in parking lots at night. I am aware of how that sounds. I am aware that it sounds like the beginning of a condition, the kind of thing a person says in a waiting room before they are handed a clipboard and asked to rate their symptoms on a scale. I am not describing a condition. I am describing a calibration. The body updates its threat model based on available data, and the data I had accumulated over those 2 nights in northern Pennsylvania was specific and detailed and had not yet been filed anywhere the body was willing to call closed. So, I noticed things. The truck 2 rows over in the Ohio Distribution Center lot, idling without headlights at 5:45 in the morning when I arrived. It turned out to be a delivery driver eating a breakfast sandwich and listening to the radio, a fact I established by walking past it at close enough range to see him clearly, which is not something I would have done before Pennsylvania. The side door of a motel in West Virginia that stood open 4 inches when I arrived at my room, which turned out to be the result of a failed latch spring and nothing more. The man at a gas station outside Pittsburgh, who watched me pump fuel with the particular stillness I had learned to read as deliberate. He was waiting for his wife, who came out of the mini-mart 30 seconds later, carrying 2 coffees and a bag of chips. He took the coffees and smiled at her, and they drove away in a car with a child's soccer ball visible through the rear window. I catalog these incidents not because they were threatening, but because they show you the mechanism, the way the body, once it has learned a new grammar of danger, begins to read that grammar into texts that do not contain it. It is exhausting in the specific way of a job that never clocks out. I learned to let the first read happen, to let the body do its survey, and then to apply the mind's corrective pass. Most of the time, the corrective pass found nothing. I filed it and moved on. Most of the time. It was 6 weeks after Pennsylvania when I drove through that part of the state again. It was not intentional. There is a stretch of Route 6 in the northern tier where the most efficient path between 2 work sites crosses territory I would have preferred to avoid, and I am a practical man, and the detour would have added 90 minutes each way, and I had a schedule. I told myself these things while I planned the route. I told myself them again while I drove it, watching the landscape shift into the particular register I had come to associate with those 2 nights. The narrowing roads, the older signage, the towns with their lights concentrated at the center and their edges gone dark. I did not stop. I did not slow down. I passed within 12 miles of that motel at 2:30 in the afternoon in full daylight, and I kept the truck at a steady 60, and I watched the road ahead of me, and I was fine. What I was not prepared for was the exit sign. It was a standard green interstate marker, the kind you pass 300 times a year without reading. This one named the town. Just the name of the town, in the standard white reflective lettering, with the mileage beneath it. I read it at highway speed and looked away and continued driving. My hands had gone cold inside my gloves, not from temperature. The truck's heat was running. from the body's response to a word it had cataloged as significant. I noticed my grip on the wheel had tightened without instruction. I noticed my eyes had moved to the rearview mirror before I had decided to check it. Nobody behind me. An empty stretch of road. Trees on both sides, leafless at this point in the year, their branches making a grid against a sky the color of old concrete. I drove another 40 miles before I stopped for fuel. While the tank filled, I stood outside in the cold with my hands in my jacket pockets, and I looked at the mountains in the middle distance, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, that I had been approaching the Pennsylvania thing the wrong way. I had been treating it as a closed event, something that happened, something I survived, something being handled by a police investigation that would proceed or not proceed according to its own timeline and its own available resources, without any further input required from me. I had filed my statement, and I had adjusted my habits, and I had trusted the system to do what systems are designed to do. But the note under the bed was not a closed event. The note was a record, a logistical document produced by an organized operation that had been running long enough to develop consistent methods and a staging location, and at minimum, a working relationship with whoever managed the availability of that room. It had been placed in my room before I arrived. That meant someone with either access to the booking system or a contact inside the motel had known I was coming, had known my room assignment, had known my plate, or had written the plate down after I parked and found a way to get the paper under the bed before I came back from the gas station. Either version required infrastructure. Either version required more than 2 men in a dark green truck. I called the older officer that evening from my hotel room in Erie, sitting on the edge of a bed in a room with a chain lock and a chair already wedged under the handle, which I had done automatically on arrival, without deciding to. He answered on the 3rd ring and listened without interrupting while I laid it out. The timeline of the note. The 2 possible explanations for how it got there. What each explanation implied about the size and organization of what we were dealing with. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said the investigation was ongoing. I asked if that meant they had found additional evidence. He said he was not able to discuss the specifics of an active investigation. I asked if the motel was still operating. He said it was. I sat with the phone in my hand after the call ended and looked at the wall in front of me, which was the standard motel cream white and entirely without information. I thought about the 14 reviews on the booking site. I thought about the man who had checked out the morning after he arrived. I thought about the woman at the desk and her careful voice, and the specific moment she had decided she had said 1 sentence more than she intended. It usually does not happen 2 nights in a row. What does a person have to witness, I thought, to say something like that in the voice she had used? Level, almost reflexive, the kind of statement that has been true for long enough to stop feeling remarkable. How many times does a thing have to happen before a person begins to factor it into their casual conversation? Before it becomes context rather than alarm? I did not sleep well that night either. I lay in the Erie motel room with the lamp on low and my phone face up on the pillow, and I thought about systems. About how a system that has been operating long enough develops a kind of gravity. It begins to hold the people adjacent to it in orbit, not through force necessarily, but through the accumulating weight of what they have seen and not reported and continued to live alongside. The owner who said people come and go. The woman who knew the pattern well enough to name it, and then immediately wished she had not. What I keep returning to, and what I have not yet found a way to put down, is the question of the other pieces of paper. The older officer had said 2 previous incidents. 2 men, alone traveling for work. Neither of them had found a note, or neither of them had reported finding one. Those are different things, and the difference between them matters in a way I have not finished working out, because if the notes were there and not found, they are still there. in rooms that have been cleaned and relet and cleaned again, under beds that have been made by people whose job is the surface and not the space beneath, waiting in the dark against the baseboard for the person who happens to drop something at the right angle, my plate number and my room number on a square of newsprint, someone else's plate number and room number on another square in another room, pressed against another wall, a record kept by people who are patient enough to keep records. I requested a different territory assignment from my company the following month, citing personal reasons, and my coordinator processed it without comment, and I have not driven that stretch of Route 6 since, but I know the exit sign is still there, and I know that knowing it is there is not the same thing as having put it behind me, and I think on some level I have stopped pretending otherwise. My wife's name is Carol, and she has known me for 14 years, and she can read the difference between the version of me that is tired and the version of me that is somewhere else while appearing to be present. She gave me 3 weeks after Pennsylvania before she sat down across from me at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with her coffee and said, simply, "Tell me what is still happening." I told her. Not the edited version I had been maintaining. The version where the incident was resolved, where the police had it, where my adjusted habits were a reasonable and temporary recalibration that would normalize on its own schedule. I told her the full account, in order, including the note, including the 2 previous incidents the officer had mentioned, including the booking site review, including my calculation about the infrastructure required to place that paper in my room before I arrived. I told her about the exit sign and my hands going cold inside the gloves. I told her about the eerie motel room and the chair under the door handle, and the question I had not been able to answer about the other pieces of paper. Carol is a school administrator. She manages a building full of people with competing needs and incomplete information, and she does it with a quality of attention that I have always found remarkable. The ability to hear what is said and simultaneously map what is not said, to locate the real problem underneath the presented problem with the patience of someone who has learned that the presented problem is almost never the real one. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "You are not afraid of them anymore." I started to say that was not accurate, that the parking lot awareness was still present, that I was still sleeping poorly, that the note was still a thing I thought about with a regularity I could not reduce. She said, "I know. But that is not the same thing. You are not afraid of them. You are afraid of what it means that they exist." I sat with that for a long moment. She was right. The acute fear, the fear of the parking lot, the dark truck, the footsteps outside the door, had been metabolizing steadily to her for 6 weeks into something different, something less immediate and more structural. What had replaced it was a fear of a different order entirely. Not a fear of what those particular men might do. A fear of what their existence implied about the architecture of the world I move through every day. I travel for work. I have traveled for work for 11 years. I have stayed in hundreds of motels in dozens of states, in towns of every size and character, and I have moved through those places with the ordinary confidence of a man who has never had serious cause to question the safety of a locked door. Pennsylvania had not taken a thing from me and left me frightened of a specific place. Pennsylvania had taken the locked door. Not literally. I still lock doors. I lock them more carefully than I did before, with more attention to the deadbolt and the chain and the geometry of what is visible from the window. But the lock used to mean something it no longer means, used to represent a category of safety that I have since learned to understand as provisional, conditional, dependent on variables I cannot fully observe or control. The note was under the bed before I arrived. Someone had been in that room. The lock had not kept them out. The lock had been, for them, A minor procedural matter, a step in a process, something between a key and a tool and a contact inside the building. Something that took a few minutes and left no mark I would have noticed if I had not crouched at the right angle at the right moment. I told Carol all of this. She listened to the full shape of it, the fear beneath the fear, and she did not offer remedies or reframes or the gentle optimistic corrections that people sometimes offer when they want to love you back toward feeling better. She just let it be what it was, which is its own form of care, and possibly the more useful one. After a while, she said she wanted to show me something. She went to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen, where she keeps the paperwork she brings home from school, and she came back with her laptop, and she turned it so I could see the screen. She had pulled up a law enforcement resource database she had access to through the district's safety coordinator network. Not a law enforcement database exactly, but an aggregated reporting system that collates incident patterns across jurisdictions for community safety purposes, used primarily by school districts and municipal planners. She had searched the county. There were 11 reported incidents in the previous 3 years involving men traveling alone for work, staying in short-term accommodation, experiencing attempted vehicle or room entry during overnight stays. 11. The older officer had told me 2. He had told me the 2 that were directly associated with my motel. The 2 he could confirm were connected by the green truck. He had not mentioned, or had not known, or had not been authorized to mention the other 9. The incidents were spread across 4 motels in the county. 3 of them were clustered near the state road corridor where my motel sat. One was further east, in a slightly larger town, which suggested the operation was not fixed to a single location, but moved along the corridor, used multiple staging points, returned to productive locations and abandoned ones that had attracted attention. 11 incidents in 3 years. The oldest one in the database was from 38 months ago, which meant the system had been running for at least that long, and possibly longer, because the database only captured reported incidents, and the officer's account of the first 2 men suggested that incomplete reporting was a consistent feature of this particular pattern. I looked at the screen for a long time. Carol refilled my coffee and set it beside me, and sat back down across the table and waited. I thought about the man at the diner in whatever small town I had passed through on the way up, the way he had looked at me without turning his head, the question he had asked about where I was going, his nod when I told him, that single slow nod of a man accepting an answer. I had thought nothing of it at the time, a local making conversation, the ordinary curiosity of a person in a place that does not get much through traffic. But the diner had been less than 30 miles from the motel, and I had told him I was going camping, which I had not been. But I had said it casually to deflect, which means I had been deflecting, which means some part of me had already registered something in how he was watching me, and had already begun to manage it before my conscious mind had caught up. The body knows before the mind does. I had known something in that diner. I had known it and covered it with the thin material of a convenient lie and driven away and forgotten it under the weight of fatigue and the reasonable desire to arrive somewhere and stop moving. I told Carol about the diner. She typed the location into the database and searched it and found nothing reported. No incidents flagged within a 2-mile radius, which means nothing, because absence of report is not absence of event. But she flagged it in a note attached to the county's search and saved the file, and said she was going to send it to the district's safety coordinator, who had contacts in the county sheriff's office at a level above the patrol officers I had been speaking with. I watched her do this with the specific gratitude of a person who has been trying to solve a problem with the tools available to them, and has just discovered that someone they love has different tools. That evening, after dinner, I went out to the garage where I keep my tools, and I stood for a while in the familiar smell of machine oil and cold metal, the smell of work I understand and can perform correctly. My hand rested on the side of the large rolling cabinet that holds the diagnostic equipment, the thermal readers, the pressure gauges, the instruments for determining what is wrong with a system and what it will take to make it right. A system that fails repeatedly in the same way I had thought in the rest area 2 months earlier has a fault in its design, not in its components. I had been thinking about their system. I had not been thinking about mine. My system, the one that was supposed to keep me safe in rooms I did not know, in towns I was passing through, in parking lots at hours when most people are asleep, had a design flaw that Pennsylvania had exposed. The flaw was not the deadbolt. The flaw was the assumption that the deadbolt was sufficient, that the locked door was the whole of the architecture, that a man alone in a room he is paid for has, by virtue of that transaction, established a perimeter. He has not. The perimeter was never his. Standing in my garage that evening with my hand on the cold steel of the tool cabinet, I understood for the first time that what Pennsylvania had taken from me was not my sense of safety. It was my sense of the boundary between what I was responsible for knowing and what I was permitted to leave unknown, and that those are not the same loss, and that only one of them can be returned. Carol's message to the district safety coordinator produced results in a time frame that surprised me. 11 days after she sent it, I received a call from a woman named Agent Diane Marsh, who identified herself as being with the State Attorney General's Office, Financial Crimes and Organized Exploitation Division. She had a voice like a person who measures every sentence before releasing it, precise, unhurried, with the specific quality of calm that belongs to someone who has heard a great many things that would unsettle an ordinary person and has developed a professional relationship with being unsettled. She said she had reviewed the report Carol's coordinator had forwarded, and she had some questions if I had time. I had time. She asked me to walk through the Pennsylvania incident in full, from the moment I booked the motel to the moment I left the county. She asked me to include everything, not just what happened in the room, but what I had noticed before I arrived: the diner, the gas station, the route I had taken, the stops I had made, and where I had made them. She asked about the desk woman's exact words at check-in, the specific phrasing, the way she had looked away. She asked about the owner's voice on the phone when I reported the truck, the texture of his irritation, whether it had sounded like the irritation of a man being inconvenienced or a man being threatened with exposure. I had not considered that distinction before. I thought about it. The owner's voice on the phone, the flatness of it. People come and go, not the irritation of inconvenience, not the sigh of a man dragged from his evening by a nervous guest. Something more managed than that. The irritation of a person performing a script that required them to express a particular emotion they were not actually feeling. I told Agent Marsh this. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if I would be willing to provide a formal supplemental statement. I said I would. She said she would have paperwork sent to me within the week and that she could not discuss the specifics of any active investigation, but that the information I had provided was— she paused here with the careful pause of a person selecting a word that is accurate without being more than accurate— useful. After the call, I sat in the truck in my own driveway for a while. Organized exploitation. That was the division she had named. Not burglary, not trespassing, not the kind of language that attaches to men in dark trucks who approach lone travelers in parking lots out of opportunism or desperation. Organized exploitation has a different weight to it, implies a different kind of patience, a different kind of planning, a different relationship between the people running the operation and the location it runs through. It implies that the motel was not an incidental venue. I had understood this already, intellectually, in the way you understand a thing when the logic compels it, but The full implication has not yet reached the part of you that responds to implications. The note under the bed, the available room next door, the owner's managed voice, the desk woman's careful script, delivered with the flat affect of a line rehearsed past the point of feeling it. The motel was not an incidental venue, which meant the desk woman had checked me in knowing what the night might hold, had handed me the key to a room whose under-bed space had already been used as a staging document, had told me not to open the door after dark, in the voice of a person delivering a warning they were not permitted to make explicit, threading the needle between complicity and whatever small private line they had drawn for themselves somewhere in the years since it had started. I thought about that line, about what it costs a person to maintain it, to check in the travelers and hand them the keys and say the careful words about the drifters, and then go back to the office and sit in the yellow light and wait for the phone to ring or not ring, depending on the night. It usually does not happen 2 nights in a row, not a statement of reassurance, a statement of observed pattern, the observation of a person who has been watching it happen long enough to know its rhythms. I do not know what her name is. The desk woman. I never asked, and the police reports refer to her only by her role. I have thought about her more than I expected to, more than I have thought about the men in the dark truck, more than I have thought about whoever crouched in my room and pressed a ballpoint pen into newsprint and pushed it under the bed. Those men are a category, a type of danger I can name and file an account for. She is something harder to file. She is a person standing at the exact border between a thing and the knowledge of a thing, handing out keys. Carol asked me one evening how I was thinking about her. We were washing dishes, the ordinary end-of-day ritual, and she asked the question in the tone she uses when she has been thinking about something for a while and has decided the time is right. I said I did not know. Carol set down the dish she was drying and thought for a moment. Then she said, "She told you not to open the door." I said yes. Carol said that was the only thing she could give you. I stood at the sink with my hands in the water, and I let that sit where it landed. The only thing she could give. A warning shaped like routine advice, delivered in a voice trained to sound like nothing. In the brief window of a check-in interaction, that was the only contact she was going to have with me before the night began. She could not tell me to leave. That would have required a disclosure she could not make. She could not call the police herself. For reasons I do not know and will not invent, that option was not available to her. What she could do was hand me a key and say, "Do not open the door." It was not enough. It was what she had. I thought about the second night when she had offered to move me to room 2, closest to the office, after I told her I had not slept. I had asked why she had not offered it before. She had said she did not think it was necessary. What she had meant, I now understood, was that she had not expected me to still be there. She had expected the first night to be enough to make me leave. When I came back a second time, visibly exhausted, telling her I had not slept, she moved me to the room closest to her, put me in the position where if something happened, she was as close to it as she could place herself without being able to say why. The only thing she could give. I included all of this in the supplemental statement. The distinction in the owner's irritation, the desk woman's phrasing and its sequence, the second night room change and what I now understood its logic to have been. Agent Marsh's office sent me a confirmation of receipt and a case reference number and a phone number to call if I remembered anything additional. I have called it twice since. Once when I remembered the specific make and partial plate of the green truck, which I had noted without noting it in the way the mind photographs things it suspects it may need. Once when I found in a jacket pocket I had not worn since the trip a gas station receipt from a stop I had made an hour before I reached the motel, and realized that the timestamp and the location of that purchase would have been visible to anyone watching me pay, would have established my direction of travel, my probable destination. my approximate arrival time. The receipt is now with the Attorney General's office. My jacket hangs in the front closet, and I have worn it several times since. It is a good jacket, insulated, the right weight for the kind of work I do in cold storage. I am not going to stop wearing it because of what was in the pocket, but I notice each time I put it on the specific weight of the right pocket, which is now empty, and I register the absence there the way you register any absence in a place where something used to be. The formal statement process took 3 weeks of intermittent correspondence. By the end of it, I had spoken to 2 additional investigators and provided written accounts of the diner, the gas station, the exit sign, the rest area, my drive-through of the county 6 weeks later. I had provided the URL of the booking site and the specific review I had found. I had provided Gerald, the foreman's name, and the Ohio work order number, which established my location and my state of mind in the period immediately following the incident, and which the investigators used for reasons they did not explain to me. At the end of the process, Agent Marsh called again. She said she could not tell me what would happen or when. She said she could tell me that what I had provided had been, again she paused, meaningful. She said that if I had further incidents during travel, I should contact her office directly and not rely solely on local law enforcement. And she gave me a direct number. I wrote it on a card and put it in my wallet, behind my license, where I keep things I need to be able to find quickly. I carry that card now the way I carry the weight in the right jacket pocket, as a marker of the distance between what the world was before Pennsylvania and what it has been since. A distance I have stopped trying to close and started, slowly and with considerable effort, learning to simply hold. Story 2. The Hollow Road Home. When time stresses, stories heal. There is a road in the mountains of western North Carolina that the locals do not walk after dark. Not because of anything they can name, not because of anything that happened once and was written down, but because some roads in hollow country remember the people who have passed through them, and some of those people were never really ready to leave. This is the story of a man who drove 5 hours with his dead father buckled into the passenger seat, telling himself he was grieving, when what he was actually doing was running. The mountains had other plans for him, and the woman on the gorge road, the one who never glanced at the truck, who walked with the certainty of someone who belonged to that place in a way the living rarely does, she was only the beginning. What follows is called The Hollow Road Home. It is a story about what the land holds on to, about what we bury instead of face, and about the terrible quiet mercy of being found by something that has been waiting, specifically, patiently, and with your name already in its mouth. Settle in. The river is running. The stove is warm. And something on the gravel track outside just stopped walking. I want to be honest about something before I go any further, because I told the lie for so long. To my sister, to my colleagues, to the people at the grief support group I attended exactly 3 times before I stopped going. That I need to say the truth plainly at least once, here, where it costs me something to say it. I did not go to western North Carolina to scatter my father's ashes. I went there to avoid doing it. There is a difference. I understood that difference the morning I loaded the gray ceramic urn into the passenger seat of my truck and drove south from Raleigh, with no particular destination, no reservation, and no plan beyond the fact that movement felt less dishonest than standing still in the apartment where his cardigan was still folded over the arm of the reading chair. My name is Callum Marsh. I am 41 years old. I was a land surveyor for 19 years, a profession that trained me to measure distance precisely and feel very little sentimentality about the ground underfoot. And I drove for 5 hours with my dead father buckled into the passenger seat, talking to him about the weather the way I had never been able to talk to him about anything that mattered, because he was gone now and talking was finally safe. He died in February. I drove south in October. 8 months is a long time to carry an urn around an apartment and call it grieving. The drive itself was unremarkable for the first 4 hours. The flat middle of the state, the long tobacco-brown stretches of the Piedmont, gas stations with their particular hot plastic smell, and the specific fluorescent hum of a place that exists only to be passed through. I ate a gas station sandwich somewhere outside Morganton without tasting it. I drank 2 cups of coffee that had been sitting long enough that they left a chemical aftertaste at the back of my throat. I noticed, at some point past Asheville, that the mountains had begun in the peripheral vision to my left. Not dramatically, not the way people in postcards describe it, but quietly, the way important things often arrive, as a gradual darkening of the horizon that you cannot locate a precise beginning for. By the time I reached the Nantahala Gorge, it was 4:30 in the afternoon, and the gorge had already begun to swallow its own daylight. I want to describe this correctly because the gorge is not like other places I have been, and it matters that you understand what it does to the senses before I tell you what happened there. The road drops into the gorge from the surrounding ridge country, and immediately the temperature changes. Not gradually, but in a single moment, like stepping from one room into another room where someone has left a window open onto November. The Nantahala River runs alongside the road, and it is very cold and very clear, and the sound it makes is a low, continuous percussion that your brain first registers as static and then, after a while, begins to hear as something more ordered, something almost rhythmic. The way white noise eventually resolves into pattern if you listen long enough. The hemlocks on the gorge walls are old and dark. The water smells of iron and cold stone and something faintly mineral, like the taste of creek water when you are very young and drink directly from it, because your mother is not watching. I had not planned to stop in the gorge. I had not planned anything, but there was a turnout beside the river with a picnic table no one was using, and my back ached from 5 hours of driving, and I pulled in without making a conscious decision to do so. I sat on the table with my feet on the bench and drank the last third of a water bottle that had been warming in the cup holder since Asheville, and I looked at the river, and I did not think about my father, which was the thing I was best at by then. The picnic table had initials carved into it. Someone had written the word always in cursive below the initials, and then someone else, later with a different knife, had added a question mark. I noticed this and then put it out of my mind because it was the kind of detail that wanted to mean something, and I was not in the mood for meaning. I checked my phone and found I had 1 bar of signal. I had 3 unread messages from my sister Claire, who still believed I was managing the situation responsibly, and had not yet realized I was sitting beside a river in a mountain gorge with our father in the passenger seat of my truck. I did not open the messages. I told myself I would respond later, which is what I told myself every day about approximately 11 things. That was when I saw the woman on the road. She was walking south along the gorge road on the shoulder, moving at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, the deliberate pace of someone who has walked this road many times and is not in any hurry about it. She was wearing a dark green coat that was too heavy for October, but not wrong for the gorge, where the cold was genuine. Her hair was the color of creek water, dark brown and lit with gray, and she wore it loose to her shoulders. She was perhaps 65, perhaps older, the kind of age that the mountains produce in women, where the lines of the face are earned rather than inflicted. What I noticed was not the woman herself, but the fact that she did not glance at me. This is the kind of thing that does not register as strange until later. People walking on a road with a parked truck beside it glance at the truck. It is not a conscious decision. It is simply what the eye does when it encounters something stationary beside something in motion. She did not glance. She walked past the turnout at her deliberate pace, and her eyes were fixed somewhere ahead of her on the road, and there was something about the quality of her attention that made me feel briefly as though I was the thing that was not quite there. I watched her until the road curved and she was gone. The gorge had gone darker by then. The canopy filtered what was left of the afternoon light into something thin and directionless, and the river sounded different in that light. Fuller, somehow, or closer. I got back into my truck. The urn sat in the passenger seat in its fitted padded bag. The zipper partly opens the way I had left it that morning when I had talked to my father about the weather outside Smithfield. I zipped it closed. I do not know why. I just did not want it to open anymore. I had seen a hand-painted sign for a rental cabin about a quarter-mile back up the road nailed to a hemlock at the gorge turnoff. The sign said Gorge View Cabins, nightly and weekly, and had a phone number that turned out to have signal enough to reach. A man named Harold answered on the second ring, sounding exactly the way a man named Harold who rents cabins in a gorge in western North Carolina should sound, unhurried, measured, with a particular cadence that belongs to people who have been answering questions about the same property for several decades. He had one cabin available. It was small, he said, but warm. The wood stove was functional and already laid with kindling. I said I would take it. The cabin was a mile further down the gorge road, down a gravel track that branched off the main road, through a stand of white pines that had grown close enough together to make the track feel like a corridor. The cabin itself was smaller than the photographs on any website it had never appeared on. One room, a sleeping loft, a wood stove, a kitchen the size of a hallway, and a narrow porch that faced the river. The river was perhaps 30 feet away, and from the porch you could see it through the alders, quick and black in the fading light. The wood stove, as Harold had promised, was laid and waiting. I stood on the porch for a while after I brought in my bag and the urn. The river made its sound. The hemlocks on the far bank were already gone to silhouette, and the ridgeline above them had taken on the gray-violet color I had noticed from the car. That particular mountain dusk that makes the sky feel lower than it is, as if the world had decided to be smaller for the night. I was tired in a way that driving alone for 5 hours through grief produces. Not the clean tiredness of physical work, but something horizontal and diffuse, a tiredness of the will rather than the body. I went inside and lit the stove. The kindling caught quickly. The smell of the smoke was white pine and dry paper, and when the first heat came off the cast iron, it was the warmest I had felt all day in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, the way warmth sometimes meant something other than degrees. I sat on the floor in front of the stove with my back against the cot and watched the fire through the vent grid. The urn was on the kitchen counter. I had set it facing the window, which was a strange thing to have done, but I had done it before I was aware of making a choice. I fell asleep in front of the stove before I had intended to. I do not know how long I slept. When I came back to awareness, the fire had settled to coals and the cabin was warm, but no longer actively so, and the dark outside the window was complete. And in the silence between the pulse of the river below, in one of those still gaps that happen even in moving water where the sound drops into a pocket of quiet, I heard footsteps on the gravel track outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the pace of someone who had walked this road many times. I told myself it was Harold checking on the stove. I told myself this with great confidence and conviction, in the same tone I use for all the things I tell myself, and I almost believed it immediately. The road outside the cabin was empty when I looked. The gravel was undisturbed, and the gorge, in the silence that followed, seemed to lean inward just slightly, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. The morning came sideways through the east-facing window of the loft, not the generous gold of a clear October sunrise, but the thin watercolor light of a sky that has cloud cover without committing to rain. I had slept, eventually, deeply, the way the body insists on sleeping when the mind has exhausted itself on a problem it cannot solve. When I came down from the loft, the stove had gone fully cold. The urn still faced the window. I had not moved it in the night, which meant some part of me had been aware of it, checking on it, even while unconscious. I stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee I had made from a filter packet left in the cupboard, and looked out at the alder brake between the cabin and the river. The alders, type of tree, had lost most of their leaves to the previous night's wind, and the river was visible more completely now. Not the dark, quick shape I had seen at dusk, but a wide, shallow, gray-lit expanse of moving water broken by pale stones. The water was extremely clear. You could see the individual stones on the bed, their colors muted by depth and current, rust orange and ash white, and the particular blue-gray that granite takes on underwater, vivid and cold. There was nothing on the gravel track, no impression in the gravel, no sign. I told myself this settled the matter. I was, as I mentioned, very good at telling myself things. The second thing I noticed that morning, and I only noticed it because I am a land surveyor by training, and land surveyors observe the dimensions of spaces involuntarily, the way musicians hear intervals in ambient sound, was that the cabin's interior was smaller than the exterior had suggested. Not dramatically, not the kind of wrongness you would name immediately, but I had estimated the interior square footage from outside, as habit, before I entered the previous night, and the room I was standing in was perhaps 8 to 10 feet shorter on the western wall than the shell of the building implied. I stood in the middle of the room with my coffee and counted the internal wall lengths against what I remembered of the exterior, and the numbers did not resolve. The western wall was short. The closet at the western end, narrow and deep, with a wooden plank door that sat flush to the frame and was held shut by a barrel bolt that had been painted over so many times the paint had become structural. That closet should not have occupied enough space to account for the discrepancy. I did not open the closet. This is important to state clearly. I did not open it because I was a man standing alone in a rented cabin in a mountain gorge who had been hearing footsteps on gravel in the dark, and because the rational mind, when it begins to feel the edges of something it cannot categorize, defaults to the practical. There was breakfast to think about. There was signal to find. There was the matter of my sister's messages, which I had now avoided for 14 hours. I identified the loose floorboard near the base of the cot, the one that had flexed under my weight when I came down from the loft, and thought briefly and completely irrelevantly that someone should fix it before it became a liability. I drove up the gravel track to the gorge road and north to a small town called Topton, which offered a gas station, a diner with 4 tables and a specials board written in blue marker, and enough cell signal to feel guilty about my sister's messages. The diner smelled of biscuit flour and cast iron, and the particular coffee that comes from a percolator that has been in continuous use since sometime in the 1970s. A woman in her late 40s, whose name tag read Bev, brought me eggs and a plate of toast without my asking. On the grounds, she explained, that everyone who comes in from the Gorge Road in October is cold and has not eaten properly. I did not argue. The eggs were cooked in butter. The toast was white bread, and the butter had been applied while the toast was still hot, so it had melted through to the plate in a small golden pool. I ate more than I had intended to. I read Claire's messages at the table with my second cup of coffee. The first message asked if I had found a date for the service. The second asked if I was all right, in the way people ask when they already know the answer is complicated. The third said simply, "Call me, Cal. You do not have to do this alone." I typed and deleted 4 responses. I sent, "I am in the mountains. I am okay. I will call tomorrow, which was the kind of message that is technically true and practically a lie, and I sent it before I could think better of it. Bev refilled my coffee without being asked, I said, because I was a man who did not know what else to say and the diner was very quiet. Have you worked here long? She said 22 years, give or take. I said, with the particular casualness of someone who is not casual at all. Do many people use the Gorge Road? The one down past Nantahala? She set the coffee pot down on the counter and looked at me with the expression of a woman who has heard extension in several versions and recognizes all of them. She said the Gorge Road was fine for day traffic, hikers, rafters, people coming through to the Appalachian Trail access at Wesser. She said the road was used less in the evenings. She said this with a precision that stopped just short of elaboration, the way people describe a thing when they have decided how much of it they are willing to name. I said I had heard someone on the gravel track outside the Gorge View cabin the previous night, walking, late. She picked up the coffee pot again. She said Harold's guests sometimes walked the river path at night. She said this in the voice of someone proposing an explanation they find adequate, rather than one they find true. I said the footsteps had been on the track side, not the river side, and had been moving away from the cabin rather than toward it. Bev looked at the specials board. She said there was a piece of apple pie if I wanted it. She said the apples were from an orchard up on the Waya Road, picked 2 weeks prior, and that it was the last of the season. I said yes to the pie, because I understood the offer for what it was. A change of subject delivered with enough warmth that refusing it would have been unkind. The pie arrived still faintly warm from the oven, with a lattice crust that had browned unevenly in the way of pies made in domestic ovens rather than commercial ones. The apples inside had been cooked down with something, brown sugar, nutmeg, a spice I could not identify, until they were the texture of something between solid and dissolved, holding their shape only partially. It was the best pie I had eaten in a long time. I ate it slowly, because the diner was quiet, and the light coming through the window was the flat, even light of an overcast morning, and I was in no hurry to go back to the gorge. When I paid, Bev said, without looking up from the register, "The old woman who walks the Gorge Road in the evenings. She has been doing it for a long time. Nobody bothers her, and she does not bother anybody," I said. "Do people know who she is?" Bev said. "Most of the old-timers know well enough not to ask." She gave me my change and did not say anything else, and her face had settled into the particular neutral expression of someone who had said precisely as much as they had decided to say before the conversation began. I drove back down the Gorge Road in the gray mid-morning, past the white pines and down the gravel track to the cabin. The river had risen slightly in the night, not dramatically, but enough that the pale stones I had seen through the alders were now partly submerged, their colors deepened and changed by the added inches of water above them. The rust-orange ones had gone a dark copper. The ash-white ones had turned translucent at the edges, like old glass. I sat on the narrow porch with the third and final filter packet of coffee in my notepad, which I use for site measurements and have used for 20 years, and I wrote down the wall dimensions from memory. The numbers still did not resolve. The closet at the western end was accounting for a space that was 3 feet deeper than a closet that size had any reason to be. I wrote the number down. I underlined it. I thought about my father, which I had been avoiding, and then I thought about the gas station sandwich from the day before, which was the kind of thing a mind does when it wants to step sideways from itself. The gravel track was empty and still. The alder leaves floated past on the river current, yellow and rust, moving quickly, and then catching in the eddies behind the larger stones, spinning there briefly in tight circles before the current took them again. I noticed that none of the leaves had collected on the gravel track, not a single one. The alders were losing foliage actively. I could see it happening. the occasional leaf releasing and spiraling down. But the track's surface was clean, as if something had swept it recently, or as if the leaves in their falling avoided that particular strip of ground. I did not write that down. Some observations resist the notepad. The urn was still on the counter, facing the window. In the flat morning light, with the river running gray and quick outside, and the mug of cooling coffee in my hands, and the notepad with its unresolved numbers open on my knee, I became aware, not suddenly, not with any particular precipitating event, that I had been wrong about why I had come here. I had told myself I came because I could not stand still. But standing still was exactly what I was doing. I had come because I did not know how to put him down. Somewhere down the gorge road, in the direction the woman had been walking the previous evening, a sound moved through the hemlocks. Not a voice, not wind, but something with the quality of attention, something that knew the difference between an empty road and one that had just acquired a reason to be watched. I have a professional habit that my ex-wife Margaret used to call my worst quality, which tells you something about both the habit and the marriage. When I encounter a measurement that does not resolve, I do not leave it alone when I return to it. I take it from a second angle, then a third. I document the discrepancy with a precision that is, in domestic life, catastrophic, because it implies that I believe the world can be corrected if you simply observe it carefully enough. Margaret left 4 years ago, citing what she described as my fundamental inability to be present in a room I was also measuring. She was not wrong. She said it more kindly than it sounds here. And I have had 4 years to understand that she was doing me a favor by being honest. And I have spent most of those 4 years being too busy to think about it. I went back inside the cabin mid-morning with the intention of measuring the closet properly. I did not have a tape measure. Surveyors carry instruments, not tape measures, and I had not brought my instruments on what was supposed to be a brief and unplanned drive south. What I had was the span of my hand, which I have measured many times against a standard rule, and know to be exactly 9¼ inches from the base of my palm to the tip of my middle finger. This is the kind of knowledge that is useless at dinner parties and indispensable everywhere else. I crossed the room to the western wall. The barrel bolt on the closet door had been painted over so many times that the accumulated layers had become a kind of archaeological record. Cream over white over a yellow that had been fashionable at some point in the 1960s. All of it applied with the enthusiasm of someone who found painting soothing and the rigor of someone who did not own painter's tape. I worked the bolt free in stages. The paint cracked at the seam in a clean line, which meant the door had not been opened in at least one full paint cycle. A season, perhaps longer. The smell that came out was not what I expected from a closet in a mountain rental cabin. It was not the smell of old coats or cedar or the particular mildew of a space that has retained moisture through too many winters. It was something cleaner than that and older. The smell of cut lumber that has never been sealed. The raw smell of wood that has been sitting in darkness long enough to dry completely to its core. It reminded me of the inside of my grandfather's barn in Chatham County, which had been built in 1944 and never painted inside, and which smelled on summer afternoons exactly like this. Dry timber and old air and something underneath it that I had never been able to name as a child and could not name now. The closet was, as I had calculated, significantly deeper than it appeared from the doorframe. I measured it handspan by handspan along the left wall. 4 full spans and a partial approximately 39 inches, or just over 3 feet. The exterior wall was perhaps 18 inches away from where I stood, which meant the closet extended into the exterior wall, which was not architecturally impossible but was the kind of decision that required a reason, and this reason was not apparent. At the back of the closet, at approximately shoulder height on the right-hand wall, there were marks cut into the wood. Not decoration, not damage. marks made deliberately with something narrow-tipped, a knife or a nail, in a pattern that repeated at intervals. I brought my phone flashlight up and looked at them properly. They were names. First names only, cut with varying degrees of pressure and varying degrees of legibility, some of them faded to near invisibility by the dryness of the wood closing around the cuts over time, others still sharp-edged enough to read without difficulty. I counted 11 names that I could make out. 3 more that had been carved below the others at a later date, in a different hand, spaced further apart as if the person doing the carving had wanted each one to have room. The oldest names I could read were Harriet, Joseph, a name that began with L and became illegible, Thomas, the most recent, cut sharper, the wood still a slightly different color in the cut than the surrounding surface, were 3. The first was Darlene. The second was a name I did not recognize, which I will write here as Moss, because I am not certain of the spelling and the cut was ambiguous on the second letter. The third was a name I did not look at for a long time after I first saw it. I will come back to that. I stood in the mouth of the closet with my phone flashlight and my hand against the right-hand wall, and I was aware, in the way that awareness arrives sideways rather than directly, that my mouth had gone very dry. Not fear, exactly. The land surveyor's version of alarm. The specific discomfort of a measurement that is not only wrong, but wrong in a way that implies the error was intentional. Somebody had built this closet to be deeper than it needed to be. And somebody, perhaps the same person, perhaps not, had been recording names on the interior wall. Not dates, not explanations, not any notation that would provide context. Just names at intervals over what appeared to be a substantial period of time. I closed the closet. I re-engaged the bolt. I went out onto the porch and stood in the cold air until my mouth felt normal again. The river had risen another inch since morning. I could see this because there was a pale stone near the near bank that had been half submerged when I sat on the porch with my coffee, and it was now fully under, and the current broke over it in a way that made a particular standing wave that had not been there before. A low, narrow ridge of disturbed water that held its shape in the current, trembling but fixed. I thought about my father's name, Thomas Marsh. The Thomas carved into the wall had been one of the older cuts. The wood around it had darkened with time the way raw lumber does when it has been closed in darkness long enough. It could have been carved 50 years ago. It could have been carved longer ago than that. It was a common name. My grandfather on my mother's side was also a Thomas, and so was a cousin I had not spoken to in a decade. There was nothing to connect the name on the wall to the urn on the kitchen counter. I told myself this. I said it in my head in the flat, deliberate tone I use for measurements that need to be stated cleanly before they are recorded. Then I went back inside and looked at the third most recent name again. The third most recent name, cut in the same fresh-colored wood as Darlene and Moss, with the same spacing, the spacing that felt deliberate, that felt like someone providing room for each name to exist without crowding, was Callum. There is a technical term in surveying for a measurement that contradicts a previous verified measurement without any change to the conditions between them. We call it a ghost reading. It means the instrument has registered something the physical world does not appear to contain. It happens rarely, and when it does, the correct response is to document it, set it aside, and reapproach the measurement from a different angle on a different day. I photographed the names with my phone. My hand was not steady in the photograph. I noticed this when I looked at the images afterward, and the names were slightly blurred along the right edge. I do not have a tremor. I have never had a tremor. It was a one-time thing. I spent the middle part of the afternoon outside, which was where I needed to be. I walked the river path downstream for perhaps a mile. On the eastern bank, where the path is narrow and rooted and requires enough attention to foot placement that the mind cannot wander too far in any other direction. The gorge walls rose on both sides to ridge lines I could see only in sections through the canopy, which was still thick with the last of its color. Deeper or burgundy here than the copper and amber of the higher ridge country, the color of red maples in their final week before the cold strips them. The river made its sound. I made my measurements of nothing in particular. I did not meet anyone on the path. The gorge, in the mid-afternoon on a Thursday in mid-October, is not a heavily peopled place. A single kayak passed on the river while I was walking. A man in his 50s in a red dry suit, moving fast and competently through a section of light rapids, his paddle working with the efficiency of someone who has made this run many times. He did not look at the bank. His attention was entirely on the water, the way attention narrows to precisely what it needs in order to survive a given passage. I watched him until he was gone around the downstream bend, and the sound of the rapids reabsorbed the sound of his paddle. I thought about what Bev had said, the old woman who walks the gorge road in the evenings. She has been doing it for a long time. Most of the old-timers know well enough not to ask. That last sentence had a structure to it that I had been turning over since morning. It was not the sentence of someone describing an eccentric neighbor. It was the sentence of someone describing a condition, a known quantity that the community had reached an understanding with. The way communities in isolated country sometimes reach understandings with things they cannot explain and do not want to test by naming directly. I turned back when the path ended at a wide gravel bar where a side creek came in from the north and the main river broadened and slowed. The gravel bar was littered with flood-washed debris from upstream, broken branches, a single boot with no lace, a child's sneaker the color of mud, a tangle of orange survey flagging tape that must have come from some project on the ridge above. I stood on the gravel bar and looked upstream at the gorge road, which was visible from this point as a gray thread along the east bank a quarter-mile away. A figure was walking south on the road. The distance was too great to resolve details. Dark coat, a pace that was neither fast nor slow, moving with the certainty of someone who belonged on that road in a way I was increasingly certain I did not. My jaw ached. I noticed then, in the hinge below my left ear, I had been clenching my back teeth without awareness. This is something I do not do. I noticed it because it was new, and because the land surveyor in me records anomalies, and because the walk back to the cabin along the river path felt different than the walk out. Not longer, not shorter, but changed in quality in a way I could not put a unit to. The gorge, by the time I reached the cabin, had begun its early dark. The ridgeline to the east was still in thin light, but the gorge floor had accepted shadow an hour before sunset, the way narrow, water-carved places do, living on diminished light and making something rich of what little they are given. The urn was on the counter, still facing the window, and beside it, which had not been there when I left, was a single alder leaf, rust orange, freshly fallen, still holding its shape, placed flat on the counter surface as if set there carefully, not blown, not dropped, but placed. All the windows were closed. I stood in the doorway between the porch and the kitchen for a long time, not going in and not going back, held in the particular suspension of a man who has just taken his second measurement of something he had hoped was a ghost reading, and found that the numbers are exactly the same. I did not sleep well. This is an understatement in the way that saying the gorge is narrow is an understatement, technically accurate, functionally inadequate. I lay in the loft with the wool blanket pulled to my chin and listened to the river and the particular creaking language of a small cabin in cold mountain air, and I was aware of the closet on the western wall below me the way you are aware of a sound that has stopped, not through any active signal, but through the shape of the silence where the signal used to be. At some point past midnight, I became conscious of a smell. It was not the wood smoke smell of the stove, which had burned down to ash. It was not the river smell, which was mineral and cold. It was something warmer than either of those things. The smell of turned earth after rain, the specific richness of soil that has been opened to air after a long time closed, that dark sweetness that is not unpleasant at first and then, after a moment, is something other than pleasant without being something you can name precisely. I have encountered that smell in my professional life on sites where ground has been broken after years of undisturbed settling, and it has always carried the same quality, the smell of a before, the smell of something that was sealed and is now no longer sealed. I lay still and breathed it, and told myself the stove produced complex smells in its cooling process, which is not entirely untrue, and was entirely insufficient. The smell faded before I could decide what to do about it. By morning, I had made a decision, which is what insufficient sleep and unresolved measurements eventually produce in people of my particular constitution. I was going to find Harold Vess, as I had gathered from the hand-painted sign and the brief phone call, lived somewhere above the gorge, not in it. His voice had the altitude of a man who lives on a ridge rather than in a hollow, which is a distinction that sounds poetic but is actually practical. Ridge people and hollow people in western North Carolina have different relationships with the land beneath them, different vocabularies for what that land contains, different levels of willingness to discuss what the hollow does after dark. I found his property by driving back up the Gorge Road and north through Topton, and then up a switchback county road that climbed through second-growth oak and sourwood onto a broad ridge with views east toward the Nantahala watershed and west toward the Snowbird Mountains, which were holding the morning's first cloud cover in their upper elevations like something cupped in a palm. The property was marked by a mailbox with Vess painted on it in the same hand as the cabin sign. The driveway was unpaved and long and arrived at a white farmhouse with a metal roof that had rusted to a particular shade of amber that looked, in the October light, almost warm. Harold Vess was on the porch when I pulled in, as if he had been expecting me, which is a thing I might have dismissed as coincidence if I had not already spent 2 nights in his cabin. He was older than his voice had suggested, mid-70s, lean in the way of men who have worked the same land for 50 years, with hands that were large-knuckled and deliberate, and a face that had been weathered to the texture of the old wood in the closet below. He was wearing a canvas work coat the color of dead leaves and holding a mug of something that steamed in the cold air. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked, instead, like a man who had been waiting for a particular conversation to arrive and was simply noting its arrival. I said, "Good morning." I said I had some questions about the cabin. He said, "I figured you might. Come up." The porch faced east toward the watershed, and from it you could see the Gorge Road as a thin line far below, tracing the river. You could not see the cabin from here. It was too deep in the gorge, too hidden by the canopy. But you could see the general area of it, the section of the gorge where the canopy was slightly darker, the hemlocks denser, the light more reluctant. I told him about the closet. I told him about the names. I showed him the photographs on my phone. He looked at them for a long time without speaking, swiping through them slowly with one thick finger, his expression doing something that was not surprise and was not quite recognition. Something between those two states, the expression of a man confirming rather than discovering. He handed the phone back. He said, "How long have you been here?" I said, 2 nights. He said, "And you are still here." It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that carries its own context, and I let it sit for a moment before I asked what he meant by it. He looked out at the watershed. He said that most people who stay in the gorge cabin come down from the ridge within the first night. Not frightened, he said. in a way that was careful to distinguish between frightened and something else. Just uncomfortable, just unable to settle. He said the ones who settle are the ones the gorge has a use for, and he said this in the flat, descriptive tone of a man discussing rainfall patterns, not supernatural, not metaphorical, just a condition of the local geography that he had observed over a long period of time. I asked about the names in the closet. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, "The cabin was built in 1931 by a man named Calhoun Vess, who was my great-uncle. He built it as a stopover for people coming through the gorge on foot. The road was not paved until 1947, and before that the gorge was walked rather than driven, and people needed places to stop and be out of the weather." He said that Calhoun had begun carving names into the closet wall within the first year of the cabin's operation, and that the family had never been entirely clear on why. "The names were not guests," Harold said. "At least not living ones. They were, as far as the family could determine, the names of people who had come through the gorge and not come through the other side. People who had entered the hollow and remained in it in one way or another. Some of them had died there, not violently, not dramatically, but in the ordinary ways people die when they are traveling through remote country in bad weather or bad health. Some of them had simply stopped being present in the world of the living while passing through, and the gorge had held what remained." Harold said, "Calhoun believed the gorge keeps a record. He said a man who paid attention could read what the gorge knew by reading what it held on to." I said, "And the more recent names, Darlene and Moss and..." Harold said, "I carved those." I said, "You carved a name that is my name." He looked at me then directly for the first time since I had come up onto the porch. His eyes were the gray blue of the Nantahala in winter, very clear, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent long lives watching landscape for information. He said, "When did your father die?" I felt the question land in my sternum the way a cold hand pressed flat will land. Not painful, not violent, but physical in a way that the body registers before the mind does. I said, "February." He said, "And you brought him here?" I said, "I brought his ashes, yes." He said, "That is not exactly what I mean." He got up then and went inside, and I sat on the porch with my hands around nothing, because I had left my coffee in the truck, and the cold came through my jacket in the steady, patient way of mountain cold that is not aggressive, but simply persistent, simply there, the way certain facts are simply there once you have stopped performing the effort of not knowing them. When Harold came back, he was carrying a cloth-bound journal, small, the size of a paperback. It's covered the color of tobacco leaves. He held it without opening it. He said that his great-uncle, Calhoun, had written down what he understood about the gorge over the 40 years he had operated the cabin, and that the journal had been in the family since Calhoun's death in 1971, passed to whichever Vess was willing to take on the understanding it contained. Harold had inherited it from his own father at age 32, which he said was the same age Calhoun had been when he built the cabin, and he had not considered this a coincidence. He said, "The gorge does not haunt people. That is the wrong word for what it does." He said, "What it does is recognize certain kinds of unfinished weight. People who are carrying something they have not yet set down. People who are in motion specifically because motion lets them avoid the setting down." He opened the journal to a page near the middle and read from it without handing it to me. He read, "The hollow holds what the living cannot yet release. It does not take, it waits. And the waiting has a shape, and the shape is a road, and the road has a walker, and the walker is patient, because patience is the only thing grief and stone have always had in common." He closed the journal. He said, "The woman you saw on the road." I said, "Yes." He said, "She has been walking that road since before my father's time. She appears to people who are carrying what you are carrying. Not the ashes," he said, "but the weight behind the ashes, The thing the ashes are standing in for, because the real thing is harder to hold," I said. "What is she?" He looked at me with the gray-blue eyes and said, with the precision of a man who has thought about how to say this for a long time, "She is what the gorge does with grief that has been walking long enough to learn the road." The cold was inside my jacket fully by then. The watershed below us caught a moment of thin sunlight through the cloud cover, a traveling brightness that moved across the gorge from east to west, briefly illuminating the dark band of hemlocks where the cabin was, and then passing on. Harold held the journal out. He said, "Read the last section tonight, before dark, not after, and do not open the closet again until you have read it." I took the journal. It was lighter than it looked, he said, as I went down the porch steps. "The closet does not have your name in it because you are going to die here." He said this in the same tone he had used for everything else, the tone of a man correcting a misreading of survey data, flat and precise. He said, "It has your name in it because you arrived, and the gorge recognized what you were carrying, and it wanted you to know it had noticed." I drove back down the switchback road with the journal on the passenger seat beside the padded bag that held the urn, and the two objects sat there together in the thin October light without touching. And I drove through Topton without stopping, and I went back down the gorge road and down the gravel track through the white pines to the cabin, and the river was running high and gray-green with the morning's cloud runoff. And the alder leaf was still on the counter, exactly where I had not touched it. And I sat down at the kitchen table with Calhoun Vess's journal, and I opened it to the first page, and I began to read. The handwriting was small and extremely regular, the handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship as a discipline rather than an expression, and it covered the pages with very little margin, as if the writer had known from the beginning that he had more to say than the pages were going to accommodate. The first line read, "I built this cabin for travelers, but the gorge had its own reasons for wanting it here, and I have spent the better part of a decade learning what those reasons are." I read until the light through the window began to thin toward afternoon, and I did not look up from the journal once, and I did not look at the closet, and I did not look at the urn. I did not need to look at the urn. I was finally, for the first time in 8 months, beginning to understand why I had brought it here. What I read in those pages reframed every detail I had observed since arriving in the gorge. The leaf, the names, the footsteps on the gravel, the woman who walked with the certainty of something that no longer needed to arrive anywhere. And the reframing was not frightening so much as it was the particular vertiginous feeling of a measurement taken twice that comes back not wrong, but larger than you had prepared yourself for it to be. I need to tell you about my father and me because the story does not make sense without it. And I have been circling this part the way I circled the gorge road those first 2 days, aware of what was at the center, unwilling to approach it directly. My father's name was Thomas Marsh. He was 68 years old when he died, a retired civil engineer who had spent 35 years designing bridges in the western part of the state, and the last 6 years of his working life teaching structural fundamentals at a community college in Wake County, because he believed, sincerely, that understanding how things bear weight was the most important thing a person could learn. He was not a warm man in the way that word is commonly meant. He was precise, and he was patient, and he was present in the room in a way that made the room feel more organized simply by his being in it. He did not say "I love you" easily, or often, or ever to me directly after I turned approximately 14, at which point we reached a mutual unspoken agreement that love was a thing we demonstrated through other means, through the quality of attention paid to each other's work, through the particular kind of silence that is comfortable rather than empty, through the fact that he kept every land survey report I had ever written in a manila folder in his filing cabinet that I found only when I was clearing his apartment in March, 2 weeks after the funeral. The folder was labeled with my name in his handwriting. Inside were 41 documents spanning 19 years of my professional life. Every significant survey I had filed, printed from whatever source he had found them: state records, county archives, professional association publications. He had written notes in the margins of some of them, not corrections, observations, the kind of notes one engineer leaves for another when they want to indicate that they have read something carefully and found it worth the reading. I did not tell anyone about the folder. I put it in a box, and I put the box in my truck, and I had been driving with it in the truck bed, under a tarp, since March, which is 8 months of carrying something I did not know how to set down, because setting it down would mean acknowledging what it meant, and acknowledging what it meant would require me to also acknowledge that the time for him to know I had received it was gone. Calhoun Vess's journal said many things. It said them in the small, disciplined handwriting of a man who had lived alone in a gorge long enough to develop very precise language for imprecise experience. It said that the gorge was old in a way that the word old does not adequately describe. Not old in years, but old in the sense of having absorbed more human passage, more human weight, more of the specific freight that people carry through difficult terrain than any one place should reasonably be asked to hold. It said that the gorge did not distinguish between the weight of a physical load and the weight of an interior one, that to the gorge these were the same category of burden, and that it responded to both with the same patient geological attention. It said that the walker on the road, the woman in the dark coat moving south with the deliberate pace of someone who belongs to the hollow rather than passing through it, was not a ghost in any sense Calhoun found useful. He wrote, "She is what accumulates. She is what the gorge makes of all the grief that has passed through it and found no resolution in the passing. She does not haunt. She tends. She walks the road the way a current walks a riverbed, not choosing the direction but occupying it so completely that the direction and the walker become indistinguishable." He wrote that she appeared to people who were carrying weight that the gorge recognized as unfinished, that her appearance was not a warning, that it was, in his understanding after 40 years of watching, an invitation not to stay, not to die, not to surrender anything, but to stop moving long enough to face the thing that the movement was designed to avoid. He wrote, "Every person I have seen her walk toward has come to the gorge with something they could not set down. Every one of them has left having set it down or having understood, for the first time, why they could not." I sat with the journal closed in my lap for a long time after I finished reading. The light through the window had gone the flat amber of late afternoon, and the river outside was doing something I had not heard it do before. A deeper register, a lower frequency in the percussion of water over stone, as if the riverbed had changed in shape below the surface without any change being visible above it. My back teeth ached in the left hinge again. I pressed 2 fingers against the joint until the ache subsided, and then I sat with my hands in my lap, and I thought about the folder. I thought about 41 documents spanning 19 years. I thought about the margin notes, not corrections, observations, and I understood, sitting in that cabin with the journal in my lap and the urn on the counter behind me, that my father had been paying attention to my work for 19 years in a language I had not known he was speaking, and that I had spent those same 19 years performing not needing him to pay attention, which is its own kind of language, and that both of us had been fluent in these languages and neither of us had ever bothered to translate. The cold was coming through the window seams in a particular thin way of late afternoon in the gorge. Not the aggressive cold of night, but the preliminary cold, the cold that is announcing what is coming rather than delivering it. I had not lit the stove. I noticed this. I thought about the box of matches on the shelf above the stove, and then I thought about something else, specifically about the morning I had driven away from my father's apartment after the folder, and how I had sat in the parking lot of his building for 40 minutes looking at the tarp in the truck bed before I drove away without crying, which I had categorized at the time as composure, and was now beginning to recategorize as something considerably less admirable. The floorboard near the base of the cot flexed under a weight I had not applied. I went still. The sound had been unmistakable. The specific complaint of that particular board, the one I had noticed the first morning, the one I had thought someone should fix. It flexed under pressure and then released, the way a floorboard releases when the weight upon it shifts forward. The room was empty. I was the only person in it. I did not look immediately at the floorboard. I looked at the window first, which was what my eyes wanted to do, the peripheral, the exit, the outside, before I made myself look at the floor near the base of the cot where the board was. Nothing there. The floorboard was still, but the urn on the counter had turned. Not fallen, not knocked, turned. It was facing away from the window now, facing into the room, facing the direction of the kitchen table, where I was sitting with a journal in my lap. The padded bag was zipped the way I had zipped it in the truck on the first day, and the bag was facing me, and I had not touched it since I placed it on the counter on the first evening, when I had set it toward the window without knowing why. My hand reached toward the journal on the table before I had decided to reach for it. I noticed this as it was happening, the arm extending, the fingers closing around the cloth cover, and I understood that it was not my decision exactly, that the gesture had originated somewhere below conscious intention, in the part of the body that processes things the mind has not yet accepted. I opened the journal to the last section, which Harold had told me to read before dark. The last section was shorter than the rest. Calhoun had written it in a hand that was slightly less regular than the earlier entries, the hand of someone older or tired or writing in poor light. It was dated 1968, 3 years before his death. He wrote, "I have understood something this year that I should have understood sooner, which is that the gorge does not resolve the weight it recognizes. It reflects it. It holds it up to the carrier the way still water holds up a face. Not to trap the face, but to show it to itself. What is done with that reflection is not the gorge's business, that is entirely the business of the living," he wrote. "The walker on the road has visited me twice this week. She does not visit me as a warning. I think she visits me because I have been here long enough that she considers me a feature of the road, as she is a feature of the road, and she is being neighborly in whatever way a thing like her is capable of being neighborly," he wrote. "If you are reading this and you have seen her and you are still here, then you are the kind of person who stays long enough to learn something. Do not leave until you have learned it. The gorge will not stop you from leaving. It is not in the business of stopping, but what you carry out will be heavier than what you carried in, because now you will know its true weight, and there is no unlearning a measurement once it has been taken correctly," he wrote in the last line on the last page, in handwriting that was the most irregular of all, slightly uphill, as if written in failing light. "Tell it what you have been unable to say. The gorge is a very good listener. It has had a great deal of practice." I closed the journal. The room had gone dim with the afternoon's last withdrawal of light, and the river outside was in its lower register, and the urn faced me from the counter with the simple, patient presence of something that has been waiting for a long time for the person on the other side to be ready. I pulled my chair around so that I was facing the counter. I sat with my hands flat on the table. I said aloud, in the dimming room, in a voice I did not entirely recognize as my own because it had the unsteadiness of something that has been held rigid for 8 months, and it is only now discovering what happens when the rigidity releases. "I found the folder, Dad. My jaw ached in both hinges now. I kept my hands flat on the table. I said, "I did not know you were reading all of it. I did not know you were paying that kind of attention." "And I did not," I said, and stopped and started again. "I did not know how to tell you what it would have meant to me to know that, while there was still time to tell you." The river ran. The gorge held the sound of it, and held the dark that was coming down the walls now from the ridgeline, and held the specific quality of silence that follows a true thing said aloud in a room where it has needed to be said for a very long time. The floorboard near the cot did not flex again. The urn did not move. The room did not change in any way that I could have documented in a field report, and I am a man who documents things, and I want to be precise about this. Nothing changed in any way I could have measured, and yet the room felt, in a way I have no professional language for, different. Smaller, but not in the way that the closet was wrong. Smaller in the way that a space feels when it becomes specific, when it stops being a room and becomes the room, the only room, the room where the thing that needed to happen finally happened. Outside, on the gorge road, something was walking south. I did not go to the window. I did not need to see it. I knew the pace of it by then, the deliberate, patient pace of something that walks not because it is going somewhere, but because the walking itself is what it does, what it has always done, what it will continue to do long after I have packed the urn and the journal and the box in the truck bed and driven back out of the hollow into the ordinary world. I let it walk. I sat in the dimming room with my hands flat on the table, and something in my chest that had been braced for 8 months shifted very slightly, the way a bearing wall shifts when the load it has been carrying is redistributed, not collapsing, not failing, but recognizing, for the first time, that it was never designed to hold that weight alone. I slept that night without hearing the gravel, without smelling the earth, without the floorboard, speaking to anything in the dark below the loft. The sleep was not peaceful, exactly. It was too dense for that word, too undecorated. The sleep of a body that has spent 8 months holding something at arm's length, and has finally, in one dim-lit kitchen conversation with a ceramic urn, allowed the arms to lower. I woke before dawn to the sound of the river in its overnight voice, which was fuller than the daytime voice, less complicated by birdsong and road noise, and the ambient texture of a world going about its business. Just water over stone. Just the gorge doing what the gorge had done for longer than anyone had been here to name it. I lay in the loft and looked at the ceiling and thought about Harold Vess and about what he had said when I came down the porch steps. It has your name in it because you arrived, and the gorge recognized what you were carrying, and it wanted you to know it had noticed. I had been turning this over since yesterday afternoon, the way I turn over a measurement that is technically coherent but practically surprising, not doubting the number, exactly, but not yet knowing what to build on top of it. What I kept arriving at was this: the gorge had noticed before I had. The name in the closet had been there before I found it, which meant it had been carved before I arrived, which meant something in this narrow cut of mountain and water had registered my approach, registered the weight of what I was carrying before I had pulled off the gorge road into the turnout with the picnic table and the carved question mark. I am a land surveyor. I deal with observable, documentable, legally defensible fact. I have testified in court about property boundaries. I have settled disputes between neighbors over distances of less than 1 inch. I am not a man who extends credibility to things he cannot put a unit to. And yet, I dressed in the loft and came down and put water on for coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the gray light come into the gorge from above, arriving at the ridgeline first, and then working its way down the gorge walls, the way light always arrives in narrow places, late, and from the top, and with the quality of something that has traveled a long way, and is somewhat diminished by the journey. The alder leaf was still on the counter, beside the urn, I had decided at some point in the dense dark of the night's sleep that I was going to go back up to Harold Vess's Ridge, not because I had more questions about the closet or the journal or the names, but because I had read the journal's last page, and I understood now that the gorge's mechanism was not the point. The mechanism, the walker, the carved names, the turned urn, the leaf placed on the counter by nothing I could identify. These were symptoms of a condition, not the condition itself. The condition was something Harold had been living alongside for his entire adult life, and I wanted to understand how a person did that, how a person organized a daily life around the knowledge that the property they managed had a relationship with grief that predated the county road commission by approximately forever. I also wanted to return the journal. The drive up the switchback road was different in the early morning. The sourwood and oak had caught the first direct light on the upper ridge, while the gorge below was still in its preliminary gray. The contrast between the two made the ridge feel like a different season, brighter and more finished, as if the mountain were offering the upper country as a preview of what the lower country would become once the light arrived. The metal roof of Harold's farmhouse caught the early sun and threw it back amber warm, and Harold himself was already outside, not on the porch this time, but in the side yard beside a woodpile, splitting oak rounds with a maul in the methodical, unhurried rhythm of a man who has been splitting wood since before the rhythm required any thought. He set the maul down when I pulled in and came to the yard's edge and waited. I brought the journal. He took it and held it without looking at it and said, "You slept." Said, "Yes," he said. "That is the first reliable sign." I asked him what it was a sign of, and he turned and gestured toward the porch with the hand that held the journal, which I understood as an invitation, and we went up and sat in the same chairs as before, and Harold went inside briefly and came back with 2 mugs of coffee that were strong enough to taste like a decision. I asked him how long he had known about the walker. He said his father had told him about her when Harold was 8 years old, sitting on this same porch, which meant Harold had been aware of her existence for approximately 67 years, which in turn meant she had been a known feature of this particular Ridge family's understanding of the land for at least 3 generations that Harold could personally verify, and longer than that, according to the journal. I said, "Does she ever come up to the ridge?" Harold wrapped both hands around his mug. He said, "No, she stays in the hollow. She has always stayed in the hollow." The ridge is, he paused and chose his word with the care of a man who has few words for this particular thing and wants the ones he has to land correctly. "The ridge is not her country," I said. "Calhoun wrote that she tends, that she is what the gorge makes of grief, that found no resolution in the passing through. What does that mean in practice? What does she actually do?" Harold looked at the watershed below us. The gorge was still in its morning shadow from down here, a dark band in the landscape, the hemlocks making it darker than the surrounding ridge country, the river invisible but present as a sound that came up even to this elevation on still mornings. He said, "The people who have seen her up close, not from the road, not from a distance, but close enough to see her face, those people have described the same thing, going back as far as the family has records of it," he said. "She looks like someone they have lost." He let this sit for a moment, and then he said, "Not exactly like. Not a perfect copy, not a vision or an apparition in the way those words are usually meant. More like," and here he paused again, the same careful pause, "more like the face is made of the grief itself, shaped by it. The way water shapes the stone, it runs over long enough. She does not look like the lost person. She looks like what that person meant to the one who lost them." I felt something move through my sternum again, the same cold hand pressure as the previous morning on this porch, but deeper this time, further in. I said, "Has anyone spoken to her?" Harold said, "My great-uncle Calhoun did. Once, near the end of his life, he said when she came to walk past the cabin in what he described as the closest she had ever come to stopping. He said he went to the railing porch and spoke to her, and she turned and looked at him. I said, "What did he say?" Harold said, "He said he was sorry for the things he had not said while there was still time to say them. He said this to her face, which he described in the journal entry I expect you did not reach, because it is written on the inside back cover in pencil, very small, as the face of his younger brother, who had died in the war in 1944, and to whom Calhoun had not spoken in the 2 years before the brother shipped out. Because of an argument so ordinary, Calhoun could not afterward remember its specific content. I looked at my hands on the arms of the porch chair. Harold said, "She did not respond in any way a person responds. She turned back to the road and continued walking. But Calhoun wrote that after that evening he slept through the night for the first time in longer than he could remember. And he wrote one other thing." Harold opened the journal to the inside back cover and read. He read, "She carries all of it with her. Everything that was not said, everything that was not done. She carries it not as a burden, but as a material. The way a river carries silt, the way a road carries the memory of every foot that has walked it. She does not want to be relieved of it, she is made of it. But when a living person speaks the unsaid thing aloud in her presence, she receives it, not for herself, for the one it was meant for. I do not know how. I do not need to know how. I know that the load I had been carrying since 1944 is lighter this morning than it was last night, and that is enough." Harold closed the journal. The morning had brightened on the ridge while he read, the sun fully above the eastern watershed now, coming in at the low autumn angle that makes every surface it touches look provisional, lit from the side rather than above, the shadows long and specific. I said, "I spoke to the urn last night." Harold said, "I know." I said, "How?" He said, "Because you came back up the ridge this morning with the journal under your arm and a different weight about you." He said this not unkindly and with the precision of a man describing a change in gradient that the instruments have registered. He said, "There is one more thing the journal describes that I want you to understand before you decide what to do next." He said, "The gorge does not keep the grief forever. It holds it while the living person is present and unable to release it. When the living person releases it, not resolves it," he said carefully, "not cures it, because grief does not cure. It changes. The gorge passes it along, down the river, into the watershed, into the larger water," he said. "That is what the walker does on the road. She moves the grief downstream. She is the mechanism of moving. But she can only move what the living person is willing to let go into the current." He picked up his maul from where he had leaned it against the porch railing when we came up. He said, "You should go back down today before the light goes," he said. "Take the urn to the river, not to scatter the ashes." He was very specific about this, his voice dropping to the register of someone delivering a precise instruction. "Not yet, not here. That is a different act for a different day when you are ready for it. Take the urn to the river and hold it at the water's edge and say the rest of what you need to say." I said, "How will I know when it is the rest?" He looked at me with the gray blue eyes and said, "You will know because you will run out of words." He said, "In my experience, that has never taken as long as people expect it to." I drove back down the switchback road with the morning sun behind me and the gorge below still in its shadow, and the river sound came up through the truck cab even with the windows closed, as if the gorge were already aware that I was on my way back down into it, already orienting itself toward what was about to happen on its bank. The padded bag was on the passenger seat. I had brought it up to the ridge without planning to, the same way I had reached for the journal the previous evening without deciding to reach. The body acting on information the mind was still processing, doing the necessary thing before the mind could negotiate it into something more manageable and therefore less true. I drove the last half-mile of the switchback road with both hands on the wheel and my father beside me in the passenger seat, the way he had been beside me for the entire 5-hour drive south. And for the first time since February, I was not pretending that his presence there was anything other than what it was. Not a comfort exactly, not a haunting exactly, but the specific and irreplaceable weight of a person who had been paying attention to me for 41 years, and whom I had not known how to pay attention to in return, until the gorge held up the mirror and made me look. I went to the river in the early afternoon, when the gorge light was at its most direct, not warm, not generous, but present. A thin and honest light that came down between the ridge lines at the angle of a late October sun that knows it is losing the argument with winter and has stopped pretending otherwise. I carried the padded bag down the alder path to the bank. The alders had shed almost completely in the 2 days since I had first walked this path, and the path itself was now open to the sky in a way it had not been on my first morning. Longer sight lines, more gray light, the river visible for a greater length from any given point. The water was still high from the previous day's cloud runoff. It moved fast over the pale stones and darker ones, and where it narrowed between two larger rocks near the bank, it made a sound that was almost vocal, almost organized, the way white noise becomes pattern if you listen long enough. I found a flat stone at the water's edge, wide enough to kneel on, angled slightly toward the current. I knelt on it. The cold of the stone came through my jeans immediately, specific and insistent. I set the padded bag on the stone beside me and unzipped it and took the urn out and held it in both hands the way you hold something you are aware you have not been holding correctly. The river ran past us. I said, "I want to tell you about the folder." My voice sounded strange outdoors in the gorge air beside moving water, smaller than it sounded inside, less certain of its own edges, the way voices always sound when the space around them is large enough to absorb them without returning any echo. I said, "I found it in the third drawer of your filing cabinet when I was clearing the apartment. I found it, and I stood in your study for a very long time, and I did not cry, which I told myself was composure, but which I now understand was something closer to shock, because I had spent 41 years believing you were tolerating my career rather than following it." I said, "The distinction matters. I need you to know that the distinction matters enormously." The river moved. I said the thing about the margin notes. I said that I had read 3 of them, standing in the study with the folder open, before I had to close it and put it in the box because I could not read any more of them in that apartment with his cardigan still on the reading chair and the particular smell of his study, pipe tobacco and old paper, and the specific cedar of the closet where he kept his good coat, still completely present in the air, undiminished, as if he had simply stepped out for an hour and would be back. I said, "You wrote in the margin of my survey of the Ha River floodplain boundary 2009 that my methodology was sound, but that I had underestimated the bearing capacity of the eastern embankment. You were right. I knew you were right when I read it. Standing in your study, and I could not," I said, and stopped. And the river ran, and I started again. I could not decide whether to be grateful or devastated that the only version of this conversation I was ever going to have was the one I was having with a folder full of printed documents and margin notes in your handwriting. A heron landed on the far bank, 30 feet upstream, gray, long-necked, entirely still once it landed, with the particular quality of stillness that herons have. Not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of absolute attention, the stillness of something that has decided the moment it is in is the only moment that exists. I watched it and kept talking. I said the thing I had said in the cabin the night before, about not knowing how to tell him what his attention would have meant, while there was still time to tell him. I said it again here, at the water's edge, because it needed the open air. Needed the river to take it. needed more space around it than the kitchen of a rented cabin could provide. And then I said the thing beyond it, the thing I had not said the night before, the thing that had been waiting behind the first thing the way a larger measurement waits behind a preliminary one. I said, I was not there when you died. The heron did not move. I said, I was in Fayetteville on a survey contract, and Claire called me at 6:47 in the morning, and I did not answer because I was in the field and my phone was in the truck, and by the time I called her back, you were already gone. And I have spent 8 months telling myself that it would not have mattered, that you were unconscious before the end, that there was nothing my being there would have changed. I said I do not believe that anymore. I believe I needed to be there, and I was not there, and I have been moving ever since because the apartment and the folder and the cardigan and the smell of pipe tobacco in the study all require me to be still. And being still requires me to know that I was in Fayetteville when you needed me to be somewhere else. The river took this. It did not respond. It did not change its register or its pace or the particular pattern it made around the stones. It simply continued being a river, which is what rivers do, and which is, I discovered on that flat stone in the cold of the October gorge, exactly what is needed. Not a response, not an absolution, not a verdict, but the simple, massive, indifferent continuation of something that was moving long before the grief arrived and will be moving long after it has been carried downstream. My hands on the urn had stopped in trembling. I had not known they were trembling until they stopped. I said, I am sorry I was not there. I said it plainly, without the qualifications I had been wrapping around it for 8 months, without the Fayetteville and the field and the phone in the truck, without any of the scaffolding I had been using to make the fact of my absence structurally bearable. Just, I am sorry I was not there. 5 words. The weight of them, once said without scaffolding, was not lighter than I expected. It was exactly as heavy as it needed to be. The heron struck. The movement was so sudden and so complete that I flinched. The long neck uncoiling downward in a single motion. The beak breaking the surface, the strike and the retrieval happening in less time than the eye could fully register. It stood upright again with something silver and moving in its beak, held it for a moment, and swallowed. Then it was still again, exactly as before, as if the strike had not happened. I understood watching this, something that Calhoun Vess had written in the journal's middle section, in a passage I had not thought about since reading it, but which surfaced now with the complete clarity of a thing the mind has been holding in reserve until the correct moment. He wrote that the gorge does not soften what it holds. It does not make grief easier to carry. It makes it possible to carry correctly, which is not the same thing, and which feels, in the early stages, considerably worse. The light on the water had shifted while I knelt on the stone. The thin October sun had moved further west, and the gorge had begun its early shadowing from the eastern ridge. And the water, which had been gray-green in the full afternoon light, had gone darker. Not the black of night water, but the deep teal of water in shadow, color draining slowly, the way color drains from everything in the gorge as the afternoon closes. I became aware that I was not alone on the bank, not with a sound, not with a shadow, with a change in the quality of the air to my left, upstream, the way the air in a room changes when another person enters it. A displacement so slight it is below the threshold of wind, registered by the skin rather than the ears. I did not turn immediately. I held the urn, and I looked at the river, and I breathed the cold mineral air, and I waited until the awareness was complete and certain before I turned my head. She was standing at the edge of the alder brake, perhaps 15 feet upstream on the bank, where the path from the cabin met the river. She was wearing the dark green coat as before. Her hair was loose to her shoulders, dark brown lit with gray. She was not moving. She was not walking. She was simply standing at the path's edge, facing the river, with the absolute stillness of the heron before its strike. I could see her face. Calhoun had written that she looked like what the lost person meant to the one who lost them. Not a copy, not an apparition, but the face made of the grief itself, shaped by it. What I saw was not my father's face. My father had a long face, a surveyor's face, precise and slightly weathered, with reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead when he was not using them, leaving a permanent red mark across the bridge of his nose. What I saw in the woman's face was not that face. What I saw was what that face had meant to me. The specific quality of attention in it, the patience of it, the particular combination of restraint and precision that had been my father's primary mode of existing in the world, in which I had spent 41 years alternately resenting and trying to replicate in my own work. I saw the margin notes, not literally, but the face carried them the way a face carries a long familiarity, not displaying it, not performing it, just holding it, the way old wood holds the memory of the tree. I did not speak. My throat had closed in the way that throats close when the body is trying to manage something too large for speech, the way a spillway closes when the reservoir behind it is at capacity. I held the urn against my chest, and I looked at her, and she looked at the river, and the gorge held the two of us, and the water between us, and the long, patient silence of a place that has been doing exactly this, holding the living and the weight they carry in the cold, in the fading light, for longer than anyone has been here to measure it. Then she turned her head and looked at me directly. The looking lasted perhaps 4 seconds, perhaps less, long enough that I have no uncertainty about what I saw, and long enough that I understood, in some part of myself below language and below professional habit and below the 19 years of careful documentation, that I was being seen in return, not assessed, not judged, not pitied, but seen the way you are seen by someone who already knows everything relevant and has simply been waiting for you to be ready to be known. My left hand, which was not holding the urn, lifted slightly from my side. I do not know if it was a wave. I do not know if it was an acknowledgement. The body made the gesture before I understood what it was, and by the time I understood it, she had turned back to the river path and was walking, the deliberate, unhurried southward pace, and the alders closed around her, and the path was empty, and the river ran, and the heron on the far bank lifted from its stone without warning and flew low over the water downstream, its wing beats slow and enormous in the gorge air, until the river bend took it. I knelt on the flat stone for a long time after. The urn in my hands felt different than it had felt going down the path, not lighter. Grief does not work in the simple physics of weight and its removal, but different in its distribution. The way a load feels different when it is finally being carried by the correct muscles rather than the ones that have been compensating for them. I had been carrying my father's death in my shoulders and my jaw and the back of my eyes for 8 months. What I felt on the flat stone in the gorge dark that was settling now from the ridgelines down was the load beginning its slow migration to somewhere in the chest. Deeper, more central, more honestly located. That is where grief lives when it is being carried correctly. Not in the shoulders, not in the jaw, in the chest, close to the thing that caused it. I walked back up the alder path to the cabin with the urn under my arm and the gorge dark coming in around me, and I did not hurry, and I did not look back at the river, and the gravel track was empty and still when I reached it, and the alder leaf on the kitchen counter had gone dry at its edges, curling slightly inward the way leaves do in their final stages, becoming smaller and more concentrated versions of their living shape. I lit the stove. The kindling caught immediately, and the first heat off the cast iron was the same warmth as the first night, the warmth that means something other than degrees. I sat on the floor in front of the stove with my back against the cot and the urn beside me on the floor instead of on the counter, no longer facing any particular direction, no longer needing to, and I thought that the gorge was a very good listener. Exactly as Calhoun had written, and that it had had a very great deal of practice, and that I was grateful, in a way I had no unit for, that it had been here when I needed something to hold what I had been unable to hold alone. I called Claire the next morning. I had been awake since before first light, not from any sound or disturbance in the cabin, but from the simple fact that my body had apparently decided, somewhere in the night, that it was done with the particular quality of sleep that belongs to avoidance, and was ready now for something more ordinary. I lay in the loft and watched the dark at the window thin from black to charcoal, to the particular blue-gray of a mountain dawn that is going to be clear, and at 6:43. I noted the time with the specific awareness of someone who knows that 6:47 is a number they will carry for the rest of their life. I came down from the loft and sat at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand. Claire answered on the second ring. She said, "Cal," I said. "Hey." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. The pause of two people who have known each other long enough that silence between them has texture and meaning rather than just absence. Then she said, "Where are you?" I said, "A gorge in western North Carolina." "A rental cabin beside a river," I said. "I have been here for 4 days," she said. "Are you all right?" I said. "I am getting there." I said it without qualification, without the scaffolding I usually build around honest statements to make them structurally safer. And the absence of the scaffolding felt strange in my mouth, like walking on a surface you've been told is solid and discovering that it actually is. She said, "Did you find somewhere for the service?" I said. "Not yet." I said, "I want to talk to you about that." I said I had been thinking, in the gorge, about what the service should be, and that I had some ideas, and that I wanted to hear her ideas first because I had spent 8 months making unilateral decisions about our father's memory, and I had finished doing that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she uses when she is trying not to cry in front of someone, even over the phone, "Okay. Tell me where you are and I will come down on Saturday," I said. "You do not have to come all the way down here," she said, "Cal. I have been trying to get to you since February. Do not tell me I do not have to." I gave her the name of the gorge and the nearest town and Harold Vess's phone number, which I had written in my notepad, and she said she would find it because Claire has always been better than me at finding things, including people who are doing their best not to be found. We talked for 40 minutes, which is longer than Callum and Claire Marsh have talked on the phone in one sitting since, approximately 2007. We talked about the folder, which I described to her and which made her cry in a way that she stopped trying to hide after the first 30 seconds. We talked about the cardigan on the chair, which she had also not been able to move, and the smell of pipe tobacco in the study, which she confirmed had still been present when she visited the apartment in September. We talked about our father's voice, specifically the way it sounded when he was reading something that interested him, a slight deepening at the end of sentences, as if the sentence had satisfied him, and he wanted to remain in it a moment before moving to the next one. We had not talked about his voice before. We had not talked about anything that specific before, because being that specific requires a stillness neither of us had been able to manage. When we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the urn on the floor beside the stove, where I had left it the previous night, and I noticed that the alder leaf on the counter was completely dry now, curled into a tight scroll, still rust orange but darker at the edges where the drying had concentrated the color. I picked it up carefully and held it in my palm, and it weighed almost nothing. The specific weightlessness of something that has completed its process, that has arrived at the far end of what it was doing, and has nothing left to do but be held. I drove up to Harold's Ridge mid-morning. He was on the porch when I arrived, as before, as if the ridge had arranged him there in advance of my coming. He was drinking coffee and reading something, a paperback with a broken spine held open with one large knuckled hand and he set it face down on the porch railing when he saw my truck, and waited with the patience of a man who knows what kind of conversation is arriving and is not in any hurry about it. I came up the porch steps and sat in the chair that had become, over the course of 3 visits, my chair in a way that felt natural rather than presumptuous. I said, "I saw her on the bank yesterday afternoon." Harold looked at the watershed below. He said, "Close." I said, 15 feet, perhaps. "Close enough to see her face." He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when a measurement confirms what his instruments already told him. I said, "Calhoun wrote that she receives what is spoken in her presence, that she carries it for the one it was meant for." I said, "I need to understand what that means in practice. I need to understand the way I understand a load-bearing calculation, not as metaphor, not as comfort, but as mechanism." Harold looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You are a very literal man." I said, "I am a land surveyor." He said, "Yes." He said this as if it explained everything, which in a way it did. Then he said, "I will tell you what my father told me, which is what his father told him, which is what Calhoun told the family in the last years of his life, when he had decided that the knowledge was more useful shared than held privately." He said, "When Calhoun spoke to her on the road, near the end of his life, he described afterward that what happened at the moment she turned and looked at him was a transfer. Not dramatic, he was careful to say, not visible, but specific and physical in the way that grief is physical. A change in the body's distribution of weight, the way a load shifts when it is correctly redistributed between the right structures." He said that the thing he had carried since his brother died in 44, the unsaid thing, the absence at the argument's end, left him in that moment. Not dissolved, not erased, transferred. Passed from him into her keeping, which was the gorge's keeping, which was the river's keeping, which was eventually the watershed's keeping. He said, "The grief does not disappear. It enters the current. It becomes part of what the water carries downstream, and downstream becomes the larger water, and the larger water becomes everything the water touches. And eventually," Harold paused and looked at his hands, "eventually it is simply part of the world. Not gone, part of the world, which is where the dead already are." I sat with this. The morning was clear on the ridge, the clearest it had been since I arrived in this part of the mountains. The sky above the watershed, a deep, specific blue that belongs to late October in the southern Appalachians. A blue so saturated it looks intentional, as if the sky has been waiting for the trees to finish their color, so it can show what it has been holding back all summer. The Snowbird Mountains to the west were fully visible, their upper elevations carrying the first thin snow of the season on their north faces, a white that was not quite white in the October light, but had the blue-silver quality of new ice. Harold went inside and came back with something small, wrapped in a cloth the color of old linen. He set it on the arm of my chair without ceremony, without explanation, the way people present things when the thing is supposed to speak for itself. I unwrapped it. It was a river stone, flat palm-sized, the blue-gray of Nantahala granite underwater, with a single white quartz vein running diagonally across its face like a line drawn on a survey map to indicate a boundary. It was smooth in the way of stones that have been in moving water for a very long time. Not just smooth, but finished. The smoothness of something that has been worked on by a patient and indifferent force, until every unnecessary surface has been removed, and only the essential shape remains. I said, "What is this for?" Harold said, "Calhoun gave one to every person who stayed long enough to do what you have done. He collected them from the river over 40 years, and my father collected them after him, and I have been collecting them since my father's time." He said, "You take it with you when you leave. You put it somewhere you will see it. It does not do anything. It is not a charm or a relic. It is just a stone from the river, which means it is a stone that has been in the current for a long time, which means it carries the current in its surface. in the way its smoothness is distributed in the particular polish of the quartz vein, he said. When you look at it, you will remember that the current is still moving, even when you cannot feel it. Even when you are far from the gorge and the grief has settled back into its daily weight and you have forgotten, briefly, that you set some of it down here. I turned the stone in my hands. The quartz vein caught the morning light and held it, not reflecting it back, but holding it the way certain surfaces hold light and warm slowly rather than throwing it away. I said, "My sister is coming down on Saturday," Harold said. "Good," I said. "I want to bring her to the river." I said, "I want her to have what I had, if the gorge is willing," Harold said, in the voice of a man correcting a misapprehension gently but precisely. "The gorge does not make appointments," he said. "Bring her to the river. What happens will depend on what she is carrying, and how long she has been carrying it, and whether she is ready to stop moving long enough to feel the weight of it," he said. "That is not something you can arrange for another person," I said. "No," I said. "I know that," he said, "but you can be beside her while she figures it out." He said this in the tone of a man for whom this is the most obvious and most important fact in the conversation, the load-bearing fact, the one that holds everything else up. And he said, "That is not nothing. That is, in my experience, most of it." I drove back down the switchback road with the stone in my jacket pocket. I could feel it against my ribs, its weight, its smoothness, the specific temperature of it, which was neither warm nor cold, but somewhere between the two, the temperature of something that has been held long enough to take on a little of the holder's warmth without losing its own nature entirely. The gorge received me at the bottom of the road the way it always did. The temperature drop, the hemlock dark, the river's sound arriving before the river itself was visible, the particular quality of enclosed air that belongs to narrow places that have been doing their work for a very long time. I parked at the cabin and went down the alder path to the river. Not to do anything, not to speak, just to be at the water's edge in the afternoon light, which was already thinning toward the gorge's early dusk, and to watch the current move over the stones and carry downstream what the upstream had given it, the way it had always done, the way it would do long after I had packed the truck and driven north and returned to the ordinary life that was waiting for me with all its ordinary weight intact. I put the river stone on the flat stone at the water's edge where I had knelt the day before, and I looked at it there, the quartz vein lit by the last of the afternoon light, the blue-gray granite dark against the pale flat stone. And I felt the gorge around me in the way I had not felt it on the first day, not as a container, but as a presence, the ancient, patient, geological presence of a place that has been holding human weight since before the road existed, since before the cabin existed, since before anyone thought to carve names in wood, or collect smooth stones from the current, or ask what the walker on the road was made of. I picked the stone back up and put it in my pocket. The river stone was mine to carry now. That was the point of it. Not to leave something behind, but to carry something forward. Something smoothed by long passage through moving water. Something that had been in the current long enough to know what the current does to what it carries, which is not destroy it, which is simply to make it smaller and truer and more completely itself than it was before the water found it. That evening, for the first time in 8 months, I cooked a proper meal. Pasta from a box I found in the cabin cupboard, butter, salt, a can of diced tomatoes that had been left by some previous occupant, and I ate it at the kitchen table with the urn on the floor beside the stove and the dried alder leaf on the windowsill and the river stone on the table in front of me. And I thought that the gorge was right about most things, and that Harold was right about most things, and that my father, who had been right about the bearing capacity of the eastern embankment of the Haw River floodplain, had also been right to keep the folder, and that being right and being unable to say so out loud is one of the oldest and most human failures there is, and that it was, at last, all right. Claire arrived on Saturday morning in a rental car. She had driven from Asheville, where she had flown in the night before without telling me she was coming that early because, she said, she did not want me to have time to talk myself out of being here when she arrived. This is accurate. This is exactly what I would have done. My sister knows me with the specific unilateral accuracy of someone who has been studying the same subject for 39 years without the subject's full cooperation. And I have spent most of those years being grateful for it in ways I have not told her often enough. She stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at the urn on the floor beside the stove and then looked at me. And she did not say anything for a moment, and I did not say anything. And then she crossed the room and put her arms around me in the way she has been putting her arms around me since we were children. Not gently, not tentatively, but with the full and deliberate weight of someone who has decided that the distance between two people is a problem that physical presence can address directly. I let her. I put my arms around her in return and held on, which is something I have not been adequately willing to do since February, and the holding had the quality of something structural, two load-bearing elements finally in contact, finally sharing the weight the way they were designed to. She smelled of airplane and cold air and the same shampoo she has used since we were teenagers, which is a smell I associate with Sunday mornings at our parents' house, and the particular domestic safety of a childhood I have been too busy to think about for most of my adult life. We stood there for a while. Then she pulled back and looked at me and said, "You look terrible," I said. "I have been sleeping on a cot in a mountain gorge for 5 days," she said. "That is not what I mean." She looked at my face with the attention of someone reading a measurement. She said, "You look like something let go of you," I said. "Something did." She looked at the urn again. She said, "Tell me everything." We sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. I told her about the drive south and the gorge road and the woman walking in the fading afternoon with her eyes as fixed on the road ahead and never once glancing at the truck. I told her about the closet and the names and the smell of turned earth in the night, and Harold Vess and his ridge and his canvas coat and his gray-blue eyes and Calhoun's journal with its small disciplined handwriting and the inside back cover with the pencil entry about the brother who died in '44. I told her about the alder leaf placed on the counter with all the windows closed and the urn turned to face the room and the floorboard that flexed under nothing. I told her about kneeling on the flat stone at the river's edge with the urn in both hands. I told her about the woman on the bank. Claire listened the way she has always listened, completely without interruption, with both hands around her coffee mug and her eyes on my face rather than anywhere else. She is a pediatric nurse. She has been one for 14 years. She has the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have trained themselves to hear what is being said underneath what is being said, the layer below the stated layer. And she deployed this quality on everything I told her without comment until I was finished. Then she said, "I was there, when he died. I was in the room." I said, "I know," she said. "He asked for you," not accusingly, she said immediately, her voice doing the careful thing it does when it is managing the gap between truth and cruelty. "He just said your name, once, and then he was gone." She said, "I have been carrying that since February, and I did not know how to give it to you because I thought it would break something." I looked at the table. I looked at the river stone sitting on the table where I had left it, the quartz vein catching the flat Saturday morning light through the window. I said, "It does not break anything," I said. I needed to hear it. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine the way she used to do when we were children, and one of us had fallen and the other one arrived first. I turned my hand over and held hers, and we sat like that for a while, with the river outside and the gorge quiet around the cabin and the urn on the floor beside the stove, patient as it had always been patient, waiting as it had always been waiting. The weeks that followed my return to Raleigh were not transformed weeks. I want to be precise about this, because the temptation in any account of an experience like the gorge is to describe a before and an after with a clean line between them, a moment of complete change, and that is not what happened. What happened was more granular than that, more distributed across small daily encounters with the ordinary world, the way the effects of a structural adjustment are felt not in the moment of adjustment, but in the changed behavior of the building over time. I moved the cardigan, not away. I did not put it in a bag for donation, did not remove it from the apartment, did not perform the particular brutalities of erasing the physical evidence of someone's presence in a space where that presence had been the organizing principle for 68 years of lived life. I moved it to the reading chair in my own apartment across town, where it now sits on the arm in the same fold it held on his chair, and where I see it every morning when I come downstairs, and where it does what I need it to do, which is simply to be present and specific and his. I went back into his study twice in November. The pipe tobacco smell was fainter by then, thinning the way smells thin when the source is gone, and the air is gradually replacing itself with something more neutral. I stood in the study both times and read more of the margin notes in the folder, which I had brought back from the gorge in the box in the truck bed, and which now sat on my desk at home in a place I can see it from my chair. The margin notes did not get easier to read. I did not expect them to, but I could read them without the feeling that the floor was moving beneath me, which was progress of a kind I had no priority for and have since developed one. Claire and I talked on the phone every Sunday. This was her suggestion, framed not as a suggestion, but as a statement of what was going to happen. She said, "We are going to talk every Sunday." And I said, "All right," and that was the entire negotiation. We have not missed a Sunday since October. We talk about our Father sometimes in the specific and unsentimental way of two people who have decided that precision is more respectful than vagueness, who have decided that naming the thing correctly is a form of honoring it. We talk about the margin notes. We talk about the voice, its slightly deepening at the end of sentences that satisfied him. We talk about small things, a film he would have hated, a bridge in the news that he would have had opinions about, the particular frustration of a crossword puzzle that he would have finished in 11 minutes, where we between us cannot finish it in 40. The Riverstone sat on my desk through November and into December. I moved it once to the windowsill and then moved it back, because the desk is where I can see it when I am working. And working is where I spend the hours that most need the reminder that the current is still moving. The quartz vein caught the winter light differently than it had caught the October light in the gorge. Flatter, less warm, but more consistent, the light of a season that has decided to be honest about what it is, rather than decorative about what it was. In late November, I filed the survey of a boundary dispute in Johnston County, and I wrote in the methodology section a note about the bearing capacity of the eastern embankment that was more conservative than my initial calculation, because I had been thinking about my father's margin note, and because he had been right, and I had known he was right when I read it, and the least I could do was let him be right in the official record, even if the conversation we should have had about it was no longer available to us. The grief did not lighten in any simple sense. This is the thing I find most difficult to explain to people who ask how I am doing, which they do with decreasing frequency as the months accumulate, and my father's death becomes historical rather than current in the minds of those who were not in the room with it, the way Claire and I are in the room with it. The grief did not lighten. It changed quality. It moved from the shoulders and the jaw to the chest, as I have said, and in the chest it settled into something that was uncomfortable in the way that an honestly carried weight is uncomfortable. Not unmanageable, not debilitating, but present, specific, requiring regular acknowledgement. I began in December to write this account. I did not know I was going to write it until I found myself at my desk on a Tuesday evening with the river stone in one hand and a blank document on the screen, and the river's sound somehow present in the room, despite the fact that I was 4 hours from the gorge and the night outside my window was suburban and flat and utterly without the quality of enclosed mountain air. I began writing because Calhoun Vess had written, and because Harold had read his great-uncle's words to me on a porch above the watershed, and because the act of writing a thing down is, for people like me, people who deal in documented, verifiable, legally defensible fact, the closest available equivalent to saying it aloud at the water's edge. The title arrived on the third evening of writing. I had not planned it. I had been writing the section about the gorge road and the woman walking south in the fading light, and I stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at the river stone on the desk and understood what the account was called. Not what had happened to me, not what the gorge was or what the walker was or what Calhoun Vess had understood about grief and moving water. Just what I had done and what I had come back from doing, the hollow road home. I finished the account in January, which put me 5 months out from my father's death by the calendar and considerably further out by the interior chronology that grief keeps independently of the calendar, the chronology that begins not when the person dies but when the person carrying the loss stops moving long enough to feel the full weight of it. Claire read it before I showed it to anyone else. She called me 20 minutes after I sent it to her, which meant she had read it in one sitting, which is what I had hoped she would do. She said, "The part about the folder," she said. "Cal," she said. He knew. He always knew. She said this with the absolute certainty of someone who had been in the room at the end, who had been present for the one word spoken at the end, and I let her certainty carry me for a few minutes because that is what sisters are for. Among other things, I said. "I know," she said. "When are we going back?" I said, "I have been thinking about that." She said, "I know you have." She said, "Saturday." I said, "It is January, Claire. The Gorge Road in January is not the same as the Gorge Road in October." She said, "I have a good coat." I sat at my desk with the river stone in my hand, and the account complete on the screen in front of me and the cardigan on the reading chair visible through the doorway, and the river's sound still somehow present in the room, and I thought that my father had been right about the bearing capacity of the eastern embankment, and right to keep the folder, and right in all the specific and unsentimental ways that precise people are right, and that I was going to go back to the gorge in January with my sister, and that the gorge would be cold, and the river would be high with winter runoff, and the hemlocks would be the same dark they always were, and that the hollow road would be there, and the walker would be there, and the river would be running, and that this was enough, more than enough, to go back to. We drove down in Claire's car because she insisted on driving, which is her way of insisting on being useful, which is her way of insisting on being present, which is the same thing she has always done, and which I have spent 39 years being grateful for. In the inadequate and mostly silent way, I have been grateful for most things that matter. It was the third Saturday in January. The drive south from Raleigh was different from the October drive in the way that the same road in a different season is always different. Not the road itself, but the light on it, the quality of the air beside it, the particular character of the landscape when the deciduous trees have surrendered their color and stand in their bare winter form, the structure of them visible now that the foliage is gone, every branch and fork and the specific architecture of each crown exposed to the flat January sky. I watched this through the passenger window,
and thought that my father would have found the winter trees more interesting than the autumn ones because he was a structural man, and the structure of a thing is what you see when the decorative elements have been removed.
Claire drove the way she does everything. Competently, without fuss, with the radio on low enough to be present, but not loud enough to interfere with conversation. We talked about the account, which she had read 3 times since January began. We talked about what we were going to do at the river, which was the thing neither of us had discussed directly in the 2 phone calls, since I had told her we should go back. We had talked around it, the way you talk around something when the talking around it is itself a form of preparation, circling the center until you are close enough that the final approach is not a shock. She said, somewhere past Morganton without taking her eyes from the road, I want to scatter some of it, not all, just some. She said, I want to put some of him in the river and let the river take him downstream. The way Harold described it, I said, yes. She said, is that all right with you? I said, it is exactly right. She nodded once and did not say anything else, and the radio played something instrumental and low, and the mountains began on the left horizon in the way they had begun in October, not dramatically, not announced, but quietly and with the certainty of things that have been there long enough that arrival is simply a matter of the observer getting close enough to see them. The gorge road was different in January. I want to describe this correctly. In October, the gorge had been in its last color, the hemlocks dark against the burning canopy of the deciduous trees, the river running gray-green in a corridor of warmth and decay, and the particular beauty of things completing themselves. In January, the gorge was stripped to its skeleton. The deciduous trees were bare, their branches a fine gray lacework against the sky that was visible now between them all the way to the ridgelines, which in October had been hidden behind the canopy. The river was higher, significantly higher, running the dark brown green of cold water carrying tannin from the watershed above. The pale stones I had watched in October entirely submerged. The river's surface broke in and urgent over them in a way that made the water look purposeful, almost impatient. The cold was different, too. Not the preliminary cold of October, the cold that announces itself and asks permission. The January cold of the gorge was occupying, specific. The cold of a place that has committed to the season fully and is not interested in accommodating anyone's reluctance about it. The cabin was unlocked, as Harold had said it would be when I called him on Thursday. He had said he would leave it open and leave wood by the stove, and there was wood by the stove, and there was a note on the kitchen table in his large knuckled handwriting that said, "River is high, but the flat stone is clear. Take your time." Claire stood in the center of the cabin and looked at everything. The closet with its painted-over barrel bolt, the urn on the counter where I had placed it when we arrived, the river stone on the table where I had set it beside Harold's note. She picked up the river stone and turned it in her hands and looked at the quartz vein and set it back down without speaking. She looked at the stove and then she looked at the western wall for a long moment, and I thought she was going to ask about the closet. She said, "Can I read the names?" I said, "Yes." I worked the bolt free and opened the closet door and handed her my phone with the flashlight on, and she stood in the mouth of the closet and read the names on the right-hand wall in the dry, raw lumber dark. I watched her read them. I watched her find the 3 most recent names cut in the fresher wood. "I watched her find mine," she said without turning, "and the one beside yours." "Darlene," I said. "Harold's wife. She died 6 years ago. He told me on the 3rd visit," he said. "And Moss," I said. "A man who stayed in the cabin 2 winters ago." Harold did not say more than that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There is a 4th one, below yours." I stepped into the closet beside her and looked where she was pointing the flashlight. Below my name, in the same fresh-colored wood, cut with the same narrow-tipped instrument, was a name I had not seen on my first examination of the wall. It was cut smaller than the others, more carefully, with the precision of someone who wanted each letter to be legible and permanent. It took me a moment to read it in the phone light. It said, Claire. She made a sound beside me that was not quite a word and not quite a breath, but something between the two, the sound of a person receiving something they did not know they had been waiting for. She put her hand flat against the wall beside the name, palm against the raw lumber, and held it there for a long moment. She said, very quietly, "He knew I was coming." I said, "The gorge recognized what you were carrying. It wanted you to know it had noticed." She took her hand from the wall. She closed the closet door herself and re-engaged the bolt with both hands, pressing the painted metal until it seated fully. And she stood with her back to the door for a moment before she turned around. Her face was doing the thing it does when she had decided not to cry yet because there is still work to do. She said, "Let us go to the river." We went down the alder path together in the January afternoon, which was already past its brief peak of light. The gorge walls casting their early shadow down from the eastern ridge, while the western ridge still held a thin bar of pale sun at its crest. The alders were bare sticks above the path, the river fully audible from the moment we left the cabin, higher and louder in January than in October, the water's urgency translating into sound in a way the autumn river had not required. I carried the urn. Claire walked beside me on the narrow path with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath misting in the cold, and neither of us spoke because the path and the river and the gorge around us were doing enough speaking on their own. The flat stone at the water's edge was clear, as Harold had said. The river was perhaps 2 feet higher than in October, the far bank stones fully submerged, the current fast and dark and purposeful. We stood on the flat stone together side by side, the river running past us with the weight of the entire January watershed behind it. I opened the padded bag. I opened the urn. Claire put her hand in first. She is braver than me in this specific way, in the way of someone who has held dying people's hands for 14 years and has made a professional and personal peace with the physical facts of mortality that I, who measure land for a living, have spent my career keeping at a precise and documented distance. She took a handful and she held it over the water and she said in a voice that was steady and specific and entirely her own, "I was there, Dad. I was in the room and I am here now." She opened her hand. The current took it immediately, without ceremony, without any change in its pace or direction or the sound it made over the submerged stones. It simply took what was offered and carried it downstream, the way the river has always done, the way it was doing before the cabin existed and before the road existed and before anyone thought to walk the hollow road and call the walking grief. I took my turn. I held the portion I took over the fast dark water and I said, "I found the folder," I said. "You were right about the bearing capacity," I said. "I am going to keep being a land surveyor, and I am going to keep filing the reports. And I want you to know that I know, now that you were reading them, and that knowing changes everything about the work, and about the years, and about the distance I put between us that I told myself was independence, and now understand was fear." I said, "I am sorry I was not there." I said it without scaffolding. I said it to the river and to the gorge and to the gray January sky visible in its narrow strip above the ridgelines, and I opened my hand, and the river took it. We stood on the flat stone for a long time after. The cold was thorough and honest, and we were both feeling it through our coats, the particular penetrating cold of a January riverbank in a mountain gorge, but neither of us moved to go back. The river ran. The gorge held its winter silence around the river's sound, and the hemlocks on the far bank were the same dark they had always been, the same dark they would be in February and March and into the spring when the deciduous trees came back and hid the ridgelines again. Claire put her arm through mine. We stood like that, arm in arm on the flat stone, two people in their 40s in a mountain gorge in January, with their breath misting and their father in the river. And I thought about what Harold had said, that the grief enters the current, and the current carries it downstream, and downstream becomes the larger water, and the larger water becomes everything the water touches, and eventually it is simply part of the world, which is where the dead already are. I looked downstream. The gorge road was visible around the downstream bend, the pale gray thread of it along the eastern bank, the hemlocks pressing close on both sides, the road running south through the hollow in the flat winter light. A figure was walking on the road, dark coat, the deliberate pace, moving south, as always, as she had always moved, as she would always move along this road that was her road and her country, in the form her existence had taken after however many years of carrying what the living could not yet release. She was perhaps 100 yards away, too far to see her face, but near enough that the quality of her movement was unmistakable. Not the movement of someone going somewhere, but the movement of someone who is exactly where they have always been, doing exactly what they have always done, permanent as the hemlocks and the river and the cold stone beneath our feet. She did not stop. She did not look toward the river. She walked south along the gorge road with the patient, unhurried certainty of something that belongs to this hollow the way the hollow belongs to the mountain, and the mountain belongs to the old slow geology that made it, and the geology belongs to a time so far before human grief that grief itself is only a recent and temporary feature of the landscape. The way a flood deposit is a temporary feature, the way a season is a temporary feature. She walked until the road bent south and the hemlocks took her. Claire said quietly without surprise, "I see her." I said, "Yes," she said, "she is walking away." I said, "She is always walking." I said, "That is what she does." Claire leaned her head briefly against my shoulder, the way she did when we were children and one of us needed the other one to simply be adjacent. Then she straightened and looked at the river, and then at the gorge road where the figure had been, and then she turned and looked at me with the clear, specific attention of a woman who has been paying attention to her brother for 39 years and intends to continue. "Just let us go make something to eat," she said. "It is cold, and I saw a diner in Topton, and I wanted pie." We walked back up the alder path together, arm in arm, through the bare winter corridor of the gorge, with the river behind us carrying downstream everything we had given it, and the cabin ahead with its stove unlaid and waiting, and the river stone on the kitchen table, and Harold's note beside it. I did not look back at the river. I did not need to. I could hear it, the January current, high and purposeful and cold, running south through the gorge the way it had always run, carrying everything the watershed gave it, asking nothing in return, stopping for nothing, moving through the hollow with the patience and indifference of something that has been in motion long enough that motion is simply what it is. We drove up to Topton in the early dark and sat in Bev's diner at the table by the window and ordered pie without looking at the menu, because some things do not require deliberation, and Bev brought it warm from the oven with the uneven lattice crust and the apples cooked down to something between solid and dissolved. And we ate it slowly, and we talked about our father. And outside the diner window, the gorge road ran south through the January dark toward the hollow, and the river ran beside it. And somewhere on that road, in the cold and the hemlock dark, something walked with the patience of everything that endures. I still live in a city now, surrounded by people and noise, and the ordinary freight of an ordinary life. And most days, the grief is simply where grief goes, when it has been carried long enough and correctly enough that it stops requiring constant attention and becomes instead a feature of the interior landscape, present and specific, and no longer surprising, But sometimes on winter mornings when the light comes in flat and honest through the window and the city outside is briefly quiet, I catch a smell. Cold stone, moving water, the mineral sweetness of a river in shadow. And I know exactly where I am. I am still in the gorge. I never really left.
Thank you for watching my video. Hope you like, and we'll see you again. Bye.